Alright guys, let's go ahead and get started today. Thanks for hanging out. If you are new, thanks for being here. And if you have been here before, thanks for being here again. Thank you. So if that's the case, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. We'll get that out of the way up top. Love it, do all that stuff. So today is a continuation of what we did in the last stream, which is we are going to talk a little bit more about dungeon creation. There's a link down in the description if you haven't seen that yet. It's not, you don't have to have seen it, but it will be helpful because we're talking about the context and how the generation of dungeons has sort of changed a little bit over time. But that's it. Let's see, other things. An OBS update. OBS has not fixed the issue with the headphones. I don't know if it's an OBS issue or a Windows issue. I've done updates on both now, and the same issue is still here. So things are just loud in my ears, and I can't seem to adjust the volume, which is very strange, without adjusting the actual stream volume. Don't know what's going on with that. Windows volume is just not responding as soon as I start using OBS. I don't know what the issue is with that. But that's where we are. So let's talk a little bit of just very, very quick recap about what we did last time. We can go ahead and throw it over. Let's go. Because the thing we're getting through today is kind of a chonky boy, and because of that, it's got some girth to it. It's a chubster, if you will. So it's going to take a little bit of time, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time. So I don't want to waste a whole bunch of time up front, and, if we have time left over, we'll talk about something else. But for right now, let's jump back in. So we talked about a few different editions, not all the editions of D&D, and not every single D&D product. It's got random dungeon generation and some ideas for how to generate dungeons and what the things that kind of go in those dungeons. So I want to kind of do this is a little bit more of my personal journey. So we talked about this, which is the first one, which is the 90s D&D's adventure game, which is sort of how I got into dungeon mastering to begin with. It is based on the old second edition rule set, so yeah, there is THAC0 in it. And if you don't know what THAC0 is, then hey, you're fine. It's just a more complicated way to do armor class, where armor class actually goes down instead of up, being better. And there's a little table you roll on. It's weird. Looking back on it now, it's hard to see how people kind of came to that conclusion as to how they calculate armor class, but that's how it was. That's how it used to be. So that's what it is in here. We can go ahead and do this rules book. So this is totally meant for new people who are getting in the game. So this is kind of like a starter set. It comes with 3 different adventures in it, and then at the end they kind of give you, hey, if you're done with this, here's a way to make some random dungeon generations, because it's not very old school, but it is old school in the fact that all the adventures you have are kind of dungeon crawls, along with some other stuff. There's some wilderness crawl and some other things, some social stuff that's in there as well. But primarily it's dungeon crawl. And so now that gives us an idea of what that would look like. So again, it's sort of built for starters, so it's not particularly long. There's only a few pages. But the nice thing it does is that at the end it gives you this nice dungeon generation example, which is something that none of the other systems do, as far as I can find. They don't show you an example of play of like how combat might go, so you can kind of understand from reading a book how the game's supposed to be played. This is the only one that kind of gives you an idea of, oh, this is how somebody might roll up a dungeon. Even though I feel like the tables are pretty clear, they're not super fancy, there's not a whole lot going on with them. There's 26 tables in total because it goes to Z for artifacts. But a large portion of those are treasure here on the back end and monsters. But only these first 2 pages are really the meat and potatoes of making dungeons. And they're straightforward, they're nice. One of the things, probably one of the biggest changes that are here, that's going to look a little bit different, is the rooms that you can see down on the bottom right there. Rooms are really small in old D&D because there's not a lot of tactical maneuvering around. So you have rooms that cap out at like 40 by 40 feet or 30 by 50 feet, which is much different than some of the larger rooms that I ran just yesterday in my game, which had a 40 by 60 room in it. When we have the ability to move that far and spells that go that far, necessitates kind of building larger dungeons to make those ranges important, and to assume that people cannot get to things in one move, if you ever want to set that up, which you should. So it's either that or kind of put in terrain that makes it difficult terrain or something else that slows speed down if you want to put a physical buffer between combatants being able to get into melee with each other. All right, so moving on from that, gives us four. There's not a ton here. Like I said, it's super basic. There's a lot of unanswered questions that are kind of in here, but it also gives these large tables here for treasure and monsters and stuff because it has to be very self-contained. Unlike everything else we're going to look at, which is the Dungeon Master's Guide. So that was the first one we looked at. This is the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which I think is still one of the best Dungeon Master's Guides that has been made. Let's go to Random Dungeons, 190. So it's probably going to be like, what, like 193? Nope, here we go. So again, there's a big emphasis for is very tactical in play, so it's very important to know the size and spaces of rooms. They're also, at this time, sort of pimping out their dungeon terrain tiles, their dungeon tile set, which you can see that they've used to build dungeons here. So you're going to see a lot of that in this book, because they're trying to sell you this physical product on top of it. That's where they thought they were going to make their money early on in D&D for Dungeon Masters, is by these dungeon tile sets, which they're fine. They're okay. I like them, and I have a few of them. They're cool for these things like the statues and stuff down here, and stairways, but for just blank grid, and they're no better than something like a Chessex map. In fact, I prefer something like a Paizo flip map, which is what I prefer, or a Chessex battle mat, a vinyl mat. Simply because these dungeon tiles are nice until somebody literally touches them, because they're not adhesed to each other in any way, and they're not weighty. They're just like thin cards, like cardboard, cardstock kind of stuff. So a bump at the table or anything like that, and everything gets misaligned. So you need a weight on them, or I've seen people who have used like a rollout piece of felt that they put on the table, and then they have like Velcro on them that stick them down. A lot of other solutions, but out of the box, the dungeon tiles, in my experience, do not work super well. Corridor is nice, and one of the things that comes in here is I think that there is turns in it, which was a new thing in the previous editions. We didn't have turns for intersections for corridors. There were no corridors; it just went and then made a turn, which was a little weird. And we see much bigger chambers, right? We have a 50 by 80 chamber down here, so quite a bit larger in general. Because these are measured by squares, which is another thing that the 4th edition did different. Instead of measuring everything by feet, they just cut it down and just made it all the squares, which are your standard 5 foot by 5 foot representation on a grid map. They're like, just count the squares instead. I don't hate that approach, by the way. I think it's perfectly fine mechanically in game terms. Sometimes it's a lot quicker than being like, sometimes you'll get I don't know, like an odd thing, and you're like, oh, it's 135 feet, and you're like, okay, how many squares is that when I'm looking at the battle map? Okay. And so there's just an extra step in math you have to do. So I don't mind that they took it out, but it does have a very sort of like, you are playing a game kind of feel to it, as opposed to maybe just using feet. But it's nice. We also have elevation that shows up here, which is really nice. Stairs that go up and down between levels, which is something we didn't have previously, because everything's, for that quick start adventure game, everything is very flat. Everything's on one dungeon level. There's no multi-level dungeons. And then there's a lot of stuff that's not in here because this is the DMG, so they have different sections for coming up with encounters and coming up with treasures, and all that stuff's not directly in the dungeon building section. One of the things that is missing is kind of a big skip over is there aren't anything for chamber. We have chamber features, but we don't have any stocking tables. We don't know what's supposed to go in each table. You have to go look for that in a different section, which is probably my biggest gripe with this edition of the Dungeon Generation rules. That there's no place there's no stocking table, which I think is extremely useful. And we'll move on to the 5th edition. That's 2014, and we got it in here. Let's see, that's our stocking dungeon. So 290. Lots of starting areas in this one. We have 10 different types of starting areas, passages. First thing, the passage width comes up. So everything kind of assumed previously that you were doing 10-foot wide passages, but this one has, oh, there's different passages. This is something that I changed sort of in, that I'm not sure I even talk about. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I have to read through it, which we're going to. So we'll find out about that in a second in my own rules. My assumption is that people build passages based off of the the creator of the dungeon, so they needed it sized appropriately. So a 10-foot wide passage makes sense for medium creatures. That's two creatures that could walk side by side in a different way. And but if they were, say, large creatures who built it, then it would suddenly be a 40-foot wide, and then so on and so forth. So you can get really, really big if you start doing like giants, a dungeon that giants created. Everything's going to be extremely large, which could be really interesting. That could really make for a very fun fight in which you're like a room that is so large that the fighter has to like spend at least one round, if not two rounds, dashing across it just to get to whoever they're trying to get to. And so it really brings to the forefront in that fight who has those long range spells, who has those 120 feet, who has the longbow that can shoot 150 feet, because they're able to be a lot more effective in combat than maybe the guy with the great sword, who has to spend a lot of time running to get to somebody. Who, especially if it's a spellcaster who's throwing magic back at them for multiple rounds before they can even get close to him. So interesting stuff. So anything else we want to talk about in this edition? Chambers. We saw secret doors come up, and then secret doors kind of took a backseat a little bit. There's not a ton of secret door stuff in here. There are some secret doors, but they don't show up a ton. Whereas secret doors in some of the old ones are both show up as a door type and as sometimes it's like a trick or trap. They're like, oh, and also there's this trick or trap that's in this room, and that is there's a secret door or secret passage. But the chambers are nice, the stairs are nice, and one of the things it focuses on down here at the bottom is that there are things that go down 2 levels or down 3 levels or up one level, up or down one level, so you can have these split levels connections and things like that. If you're building a larger dungeon, which I'm trying to think of in fourth edition, we didn't do a lot of straight like dungeon crawling, like old school dungeon crawling, where you're going through very long, large dungeons, and not a ton of that gameplay. Uh, but fourth edition is a very strange beast because it's very focused on sort of the miniatures tactical combat. So there's a lot of combat and it takes up a lot of time, especially in fourth edition, because everything's very intricate and kind of noodly. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's interruptions, reactions, uh, and no actions and free actions that take place at any time, and plus your normal stuff that you do on your turn. There's a lot going on, so that's a lot of start stop sometimes in combat, with especially with all the interrupts and reactions and stuff. So there's a lot more focus on that and less focus on traditional dungeon crawling, but I don't think they knew that when they were making the DMG because the game hadn't come out yet. So and then you get some very specific things that kind of come in here about, oh, these are different chambers for very specific types of dungeons, the lair, the planar gate, the maze, the mine. But by the time we get to fifth edition, dungeon crawling kind of falling very much out of favor. Not a ton of dungeon crawling going on. I mean, we look at the adventures that we got for fifth edition, and the only one that's really, really a dungeon crawl in the strictest sense would be, I guess, Mad Mage. Right? That's the classic mega dungeon. But most of the published adventures are kind of overworldy adventures. There's different places you go to on the map, and you talk to a bunch of different people. And oftentimes they have small dungeons in them, but not usually a ton of big dungeons. Though I think the stuff that's dealing with Tiamat, the early stuff, also has quite a bit of dungeons in it. I remember that. I think you do quite a bit of dungeon delving in that aspect. But there's also a bunch of overland travel and a dragon attack and all sorts of weird stuff that happens in an infiltration mission. And there's a lot of different things that you do in that game, but there is quite a bit of dungeon crawling as well. But that makes sense because I think that's the very first like full meal deal adventure that's put out for the 2014 fifth edition. We have these cool D100 tables that are tied to specific types of dungeons. That's something that's replicated in the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide. So that's good too, especially for like dungeon dressing, which is really nice. And stocking it with monsters that would show up in different types of dungeons. Then you have this nice dungeon general dungeon chambers thing that you also roll in addition to. So you kind of combine this list with one of the other tombs, you kind of put those together and you can figure stuff out. It's also the first time that we come up with sort of like chamber states as to what kind of state the dungeon itself is in, the chambers of the dungeon is in. It's something that I try to replicate. So try to show the age of it, and the age of it will determine what kinds of obstacles or challenges are in it. You're going to have more tricks and traps, or you're going to have more hazards and obstacles because either the dungeon is really deteriorating or it's in a really good condition, which means that all the traps function in it. Whereas in the one that's mainly like hazards, you might have like a bunch of chasms or crevasses, holes that are in the ground, that falling debris from the ceiling, a stairway that collapses under you, all that sort of deterioration kind of stuff. There's a lot of more doors that are stuck rather than locked, those kind of things. And wild magic stuff like that. That's the kind of stuff that I think about. And then we get a nice chamber contents table. We get one that comes back. It's a D100 table. I feel like this table is a little overwrought. This is basically the exact same table that I use. It's a 2D6 table. It's a lot easier to parse and actually has, surprisingly, though it might not seem like it, more results on it, more potential results that you can have on it. But it is also nice to see the monster motivation table in there as well, is to give us an idea of like, all right, what are the monsters doing? But the hazards kind of stuff in here. Obstacles, trap effects, empty rooms, telling you about why it might be important to put some empty rooms in your dungeon, or what to do with those empty rooms. So often those are like a place to take a breath. Those are good places for short rests. If they can barricade them in, they can try to go to sleep, but sleeping in the middle of a dungeon is usually not a great idea. Or at least it's not the way that I run it, because it's like breaking into somebody's house and doing a Goldilocks and be like, I'm just going to get in their bed. And we'll see what happens. Hopefully they won't be upset when they get back and not, try to hurt me or drag me out of their home or anything like that. They'll probably be cool with me, just a random person who broke into their home and just sleeping in their bed. I'm sure they'll be fine with it. Or more important, or more likely to be sleeping in like their basement or their cellar or their pantry or something, at the closet somewhere that you barricaded yourself into, and some dungeon dressing, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot. What I noticed with the fifth edition stuff, we don't have as much of the building block stuff. Like a lot of this stuff, when you look at the dungeon hazard table that's got 6 entries on it, and you're like, that's kind of anemic. And then we spend all this time in the latter part talking about the dungeon dressing, the description of the dungeon, where we see descriptions are becoming a lot more important than the nuts and bolts of building the dungeon, what the dungeon's actually constructed of. And I think we're going to see that continue as we go forward with D&D under Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, because that takes us immediately into the 2024 DMG, which for the 2024 DMG, and this was the first time I looked it up when I was preparing for the last stream. If you look at this table of contents here, there's no dungeon generation tables in here. It has been removed. They are not in the new Dungeon Master's Guide. And I went, I hadn't looked for them, but it's very surprising to me that they're not in there. You only get sort of this very, very small section. You get on dungeons when it comes to the DN's toolbox. You get this one little section of dungeons on page 65, which I believe is like 2 tables. You get a dungeon quirks table, like what makes this dungeon weird. 59 through 61, entrance concealed behind a waterfall. I mean, okay. Or it's a weird table too, because like you have 62 through 64, which is floating on the sea. It's like, oh well, I'm making a dungeon for a landlocked area, so how is that going to work? I'm going to have to build like a portal, something that teleports them to this dungeon, maybe. Which I mean, you can do, but it's hard when it's geographically set in a weird spot that doesn't make sense. Or you just roll down. And then they get down to, mapping a dungeon, wear and tear, natural features, secrets. All of this advice, I will say, is good advice. Like, the stuff that's in here is really good advice. But it's also incredibly vague. it's more, to me, it always feels, and I feel like a lot of the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide feels like this, is it feels like reminders. It feels like reminders for people who already know how to run the game. Like, hey, remember to put wear and tear in your dungeons. Yeah, I need to do that. Okay, let me go back and make some notes about like how pristine things are, how run down things are, or the ceiling supports. Oh, right, I should put some pillars in this room because it's a big room. That gives them some cover and some things to work around. But none of this stuff is like a lot of good rolling stuff. You have the D6 table for States of Ruin, and then that's it. And then you move on to environmental effects. So this is all you get for making dungeons. You get two tables, none of which tell you how to make dungeons. They kind of give you some vague advice about building dungeons, mapping principles, and most of it's mapping principles. And then different types like, oh, crypts, guard posts, living quarters, shrines, vaults, work areas. So, yeah. So I'm thinking that this is going to be, if this is a prognostication of like things that are be coming down the line, we're going to see Dungeons and Dungeons fade more and more into the background of official D&D, which I think makes sense with the current player base. I think a lot of most of the current player base, I would say, are people who have come into through fifth edition and that big swell. You have the triple threat, you have Pandemic, you have Critical Role, and Stranger Things all together, bringing people back in into the hobby sort of at the same time or into it for the very first time. And a lot of it kind of comes more from that theater kid storyteller aspect that people are that's what more people are wanting out of the game, and fewer people are wanting the necessarily the game aspect of it. So I think the people who wanted the more in-depth systems that are a lot crunchier, they've moved on to things like Pathfinder, and those people who are more interested in the exploration and investigation aspects who really want to pile up on the dungeons and playing clever play and investigating things and figuring out traps and puzzles and all those stuff have moved more towards sort of OSR products. So that leaves that really the only people you've got here is sort of your critical role people who come in through the Stranger Things, through the critical role, through the pandemic, through other aspects of sort of blooming of like geek culture overall that kind of brought into the D&D. And I think there's a lot more of that sort of theater, this idea that the less of a game, more of a collaborative storytelling tool, which is I think how a lot of people are viewing it now. A lot of the audience is viewing it. So and dungeons don't necessarily fit super well into that. Agreed. It's a lot easier to have a lot of NPC interactions and all that stuff when you're not in the dungeon. If you're just in a city or searching for something between different towns and stuff, you're tracking down killers or monsters or whatever you're doing, getting out of the dungeon. Because when you're in the dungeon, you're pretty much, for the most part, relegated to intro party roleplay. So it really, and I see this in my current Friday game that I'm running, is it really drops in and really focuses on the players have to be the ones that spur those moments. It's Dungeon Master. There's only so many times that I can ask, "Oh, this thing happened in this dungeon. How do you feel about that?" Where it's really more about like, "Oh, this person had bad roles, and now we make up a sort of role play in character." And I think some people latch onto that and do that really well, and other people don't latch onto it as well. It's very, again, this is one of those sort of older school, newer school kind of things. Is there's a lot more. I feel like newer people who come in the group who feel need a little bit more hand holding, need like a drip of like the dungeon master telling me what to do. Whereas there's a lot of the old school play is like, hey, I have ideas of what to do, and dungeon master's there to help me kind of facilitate that and step in with the rules and the dice when that's needed for roles. Otherwise, and the old school PCs are very character motivated. They're like, I'm here to make money. I have my own personal goals. And I'm going into dungeons because there's a lot of money in there, and I need that wealth for something. Usually, it's to become landed nobility in old school D&D. It's like you're trying to amass wealth to not have to go dungeon delving or basically work a job. You're trying to. It's a get rich quick scheme for the most part, or get at least rich to the enough points where you can have a comfortable living, and then maybe you can pay other people to go dungeon delving for you. You can patron other adventuring parties, lower level adventuring parties, as you sort of become. I used the music analogy before. You kind of change from being a record artist to a music producer because that's a lot more. It's a lot more stable income and doesn't rely only on your talents. It actually, because you kind of disperse that among a lot of other people's talents, it makes it easier to more reliably make money. Which is a very different style of play than today's D&D, which is sort of theater kid Avengers. Not in a necessarily derogatory way. That's just how the game is played. Where it's just like five people against the world, and uh, we all have issues we need to talk about. Again, not bad. It's just a very different style of play. So yeah, and so that brings us up to our current topic, which is going to be today my personal dungeon creation guide. This is the guide that I use most of the time. So I've tried to put this up on Coffee, that's ko-fi.com. You see the link there up the top, /Red Ragged Fiend. I was going to put this up, but it requires, I guess I lost PayPal verification at some point, so I needed to do the verification for that, but that takes days. And until I do that, I guess the store doesn't go live on Coffee, so I couldn't post the file there. So we'll get around to it, hopefully, and you'll be able to get your hands on it very easily. And so, if you're waiting for it, go over to ko-fi.com/redraggedfiend and just follow me, and you should get the notification whenever I get around to actually getting it up, which could take days, weeks, who knows at this point. But I'll try to get it up whenever I can. But let's get into the subject itself. So this is a guided thing. I wrote it. It's about 24 pages long, or it is 24 pages long. Which sounds like a lot, but a lot of it is sort of this first page. There's a lot of this commentary, editorializing, talking about stuff about dungeons rather than my personal aspect, which is I really only need the tables because I've internalized a lot of this, and it's my own sort of ideas about building dungeons and how to do them. So I don't necessarily need subjects like why run dungeons. I already know why I run dungeons. But let's go ahead and start walking through. So why run dungeons? Classic D&D Dungeon Delve represents the best prep-to-play ratio for dungeon masters. A single dungeon level, or zone, often takes players multiple sessions to explore, and only a few hours for a DM to create. Also, dungeons are finite spaces that help focus adventuring parties and reduce the amount of what-if scenarios and tangents a DM needs to prepare for a session. So, dungeons are extremely good, especially for new dungeon masters, is what we're saying. Is that you don't have to worry about building out a world. You only need to worry about building out, if you're making a 5-room dungeon, 5 rooms. Everything, your entire world gets shrunk down into 5 rooms. So everything that can happen within 5 rooms, which is a little bit easier than all the shenanigans that your players could get up to in the overworld. So it's very nice. It's a very nice, easy way to get into D&D as a dungeon master. And it's a nice break of pace. Like I said, the prep to play ratio is really, really good on dungeons. Where trying to prep a bunch of open world stuff, it can be really difficult. It's really time consuming. I like to do it. It's fun, but it is time consuming, and it takes a lot, and there's still a whole bunch of improvising you have to do on the spot. Whereas in the dungeons, and I've been running current dungeon they've been in, we just finished their 3rd session in the dungeon, 3rd or 4th session in the dungeon? 3rd session. 3rd session. And they're just about done with it, so it's taken just a little bit longer than I thought it would be, but not by much, because I think they're right towards the end of it. But I only needed to prep it for the 1 week, and then I had all that prep done. And sure, there's little notes I got to make about stuff they've done, or character interactions that they've had, or things they've discovered along the way, or things that I needed to improvise. But for the most part, that prep's been done, so I haven't really needed to prep for almost a month now, which is nice. It's a nice break. So if you're a DM that's feeling a lot of burnout, I'd say sit down and take a week to make a really nice dungeon that something like this guide would help you with, and you can sit down and do that, and then you'll have a few weeks off so you can really recharge, percolate about what you want to do next in your campaign, and move on from there. What the next adventure is going to be. So, what is the goal of this dungeon creation document? Creating a thoughtful dungeon using your mind is difficult and tedious. Agreed. This guide provides a skeleton to structure a dungeon environment and provide plenty of random tables, design tips, and flourishes to keep things fresh. As with any supplement with randomization elements, ultimately you are the arbiter of what gets included. A fun idea should always trump random rolls. You are free to choose options that unlock your creativity and alter or re-roll results that don't fit the desired tone of your dungeon. Another thing that's a really good technique that I've used, I think a lot of experienced dungeon masters and game masters use, but we don't often talk about, is that on random roll tables, we'll roll two results and try to mash them together or take the one that feels the best. Just right off the bat, like instead of rolling one and then rolling one result and then trying to think, oh, maybe, maybe not, roll twice and be like, oh, this would definitely work, or this might work. We kind of like, meld these things together, and then by doing that, come up with something that's even more unique and strange. And sometimes that helps to add that strange element into dungeons, which sometimes I need help with. Sometimes I'm going to make them a little too practical, so it's helpful to have a way built in just by rolling twice and trying to get my mind to do a little mental gymnastics to figure out what that might look like. We'll probably do an example as we go through, so you can see what I'm talking about if you're not quite grasping it. So, our document layout: dungeon background setup, dungeon chambers and stocking, mapping and putting it all together, and dungeon miscellany. So that's some extra stuff, some extra roll tables that are sort of in the back that are pretty helpful. So this is something new that we haven't seen in any of the dungeon creation documents that we've done so far, is this sort of dungeon background step. 5e touches on it just briefly, but that's it. This is a little bit more built out, so we want to focus on what's going on with the dungeon. Why is this thing here? What is it? What is it doing? Who made it? Who's in it? That sort of stuff. This section is dedicated to setting up the background and history of your dungeon. It will tell you what type of dungeon it is, who are the dungeon creators and or initial occupants, who occupies the dungeon now, and the current status of the dungeon when the adventure begins. You will finish this section by considering how to incorporate the dungeon into your game. Ba-da-ba! Sometimes these are the steps that don't get put in a lot of dungeon stuff, is trying to figure out, okay, how do I ground this dungeon into my game? And this can be the helpful part of it. How does it make it feel like a real place that's in the world? Which I would juxtapose that to something that's maybe a little bit more like Funhouse dungeons, like old school dungeons. When I think about something like Tomb of Annihilation, the Sarax dungeon, like, yeah, I mean, the guy's just kind of making a place to kill people, and people keep showing up to it. It's a little weird. It's not impossible, and there's a time and place for mad Funhouse kind of Mad Mage Funhouse style dungeons, but I think that they should be pretty rare rather than kind of the go-to sometimes, which can often be the case. Once you get beyond sort of goblins in a cave, and then you're like liches who built a death machine, and people keep going into the death machine, and you wonder, why? Why are you doing that? Just seal this place off. It'll be fine. Leave the lich in there. Or demi-lich in that case. So, 3 dungeon types. There are 3 primary sort of like archetypes of dungeons that are sort of, we'll call them sort of proto-categories, archetypes. Yeah, archetypes is a good word for it. But proto-categories of dungeons. So there is the complex. That is a place where one or more purposefully designed and built structures to serve as a creature's home or workplace. Examples include fortresses, mines, settlements, and ships. So that gives us an idea that we can extrapolate a lot of this dungeon design to talk about locations in general. If you start thinking about a city that you're going to run an adventure as a dungeon, now you can think about individual locations within the city as being sort of different chambers or zones of a dungeon in that way. And that can be a much easier way to sort of organize a larger scale, like urban adventure that you want to run, while still kind of giving it this familiar framework to work it within. You just don't show the walls to the players. You're like, okay, once they get in here, there are these different types of enemies that are in here. Here's this sort of information they can find, this sort of treasure they can find. There are these kinds of traps or obstacles they need to overcome, or they can overcome, and you can kind of make little lists and stuff like that. So you can extrapolate things out from this dungeon method once you start to understand the dungeon method and how it works. You can extrapolate things out and do things like, okay, I can make a sailing ship and treat it as a dungeon. Okay, what would that look like? How are these rooms connected? How do you go through them? Every there's an old piece of advice. I don't know if it's advice, maybe it's just color commentary about D&D. Is that when you boil it down, you can make just about anything a dungeon. Everything in D&D can be a dungeon. If you really think about it just for a little bit, you're like, yeah, everything's a dungeon. Overlay and crawl, kind of a dungeon. They all kind of play by the same rules. So that's a complex. It's our first type. The second type is natural structure. A natural or organic chambers and passages, such as a cave system, forests, other wilderness areas can be further abstracted into point crawl dungeons. This also includes things if you want to do like a Legend of Zelda kind of stuff, and you want it to be like inside Jabu Jabu. You want to be like inside a creature, you could do that. And if you want like a massive like Midgard serpent that spans the world at the equator and like Ouroboros its way around the world, you'd be like, oh well, there's you can just be inside the monster, and that's the dungeon. You can also make those really weird, like fleshy stuff, like the Mind Flayer stuff that's in Baldur's Gate 3 and things like that. And again, you can be abstract those things out into sort of point crawl dungeons, which is very helpful for planning larger and different types of adventures. Kind of use that dungeon framework the same. Just like I said, you just kind of take the walls off the dungeon, and you still kind of have the same framework by creating basically zones or point crawls. And a vault. So we have complex. That's where people live and work. A natural structure. So that's sort of a cave system or something that people have moved into or are inhabiting, or something's in there, some sort of monsters in there, and some sort of treasure and stuff in there. And the last type is vault, a place to secure and store a creature, item, or idea. While functionally the same from a dungeon creation perspective, vaults come in two flavors. Prisons, they protect the world from the contents of the dungeon, and havens, they protect the contents of the dungeon from the world. So you might go, if you look at it like a heist is a haven. Now, that's a vault that's a haven. You're trying to get in there and grab something, but everything that's built in that dungeon is meant to keep people out of it. Then you have something that's like a prison, like this is where, and if you look at something like, hey, what would be a good example? Like maybe somebody's chained up a dragon somewhere, and like the whole idea of this is that it's meant to keep the dragon in, not necessarily to keep people out. Like I said, the vaults are very similar when you're building them, but it's more like which way are the challenges pointed? Are they pointed at people coming in or people trying to get out? Which are two different ways to look at it. So sometimes you have something like a prison, which actually might be a little bit easier to get into but harder to get out of, and a haven is usually harder to get into. Havens are a little bit more like heists, and prisons are a little bit more like prison breaks, where getting in is usually not the most or getting in is usually not the most difficult part. It's getting out that's usually the most difficult part, which is usually a little bit different than like a heist. Usually the hard part's getting in. And you can choose to roll randomly to determine the initial dungeon type if you want. Note that dungeon types can be different for each dungeon, faction, level, or zone. For example, an old workshop, a complex, could be used as a prison, a vault, by a different faction. Or a dwarven mine can connect to a natural cavern system, so you can have multiple things kind of happening at the same. So once you start spreading out the dungeon, if you want to make a larger dungeon, you start mixing all these elements together, and that keeps everything kind of fresh and interesting. Uh, Going from a dwarven mine to something like a natural cavern system, a la the Underdark or something like that, is extremely common and tropish in D&D. It happens all the time. It's very Mines of Moria, the dwarves dug too deep kind of thing. So stuff like that is very common, very easy to do. You could do something like you could have a vault, which is like maybe a library or a uh, some sort of magical archive that's attached to a complex, which is maybe like a university or a school or some sort of research department who works with that stuff. And then you can have those things kind of intermix and go back and forth, and then maybe that stuff's within a cave system somewhere, so you can actually start mixing all of them together. If you build a large enough dungeon to do that, which is going to be up to you. Only you know how much you like making dungeons and how much your group likes delving dungeons. So you can't make them. A lot of groups have a threshold for how much dungeon they can handle, and that kind of differs between groups. Some groups are beer and pretzel groups, and they're super happy to just kick down doors and kill orcs, and so long dungeon crawls are super great for them because that's the aspect of the game they want to focus on. If you have a lot of players who want to focus a little bit more on the role play side and the social interaction, dungeons can be pretty weak in that unless you're doing something like a nice Underdark crawl or something like that, where there's multiple towns and settlements they can go to and talk to people and do that stuff as well. But like we said, you can make that natural structure, that immense Underdark cavern. You can extrapolate that out into sort of a point crawl dungeon, mega dungeon in itself, and then each zone has its own like little adventures in it. They can be their own little dungeons. They can have these settlements and stuff. People that can patronize, and by that I mean be patrons for the adventuring group. They have adventures for them to go on when they get there. All right, dungeon creators. Most dungeons that have something worthwhile for adventurers to plumb have some sort of dungeon creator. The creators built and used the complex, created the vault, or first inhabited the natural structure. Even seemingly natural structures can be created, such as a jungle by a dryad or druid, or a dire rabbit Fluffle's warren. This is one of the things that I had to look up when I was making this. I did not know what a group of rabbits was called. I'd heard it called a warren before, but the warren is also where they live. A group of rabbits is called a Fluffle. Did you know that? I didn't know that. That's weird. So the easiest way to do that is to choose a role on this 1d12 dungeon creator table. And like I said, sometimes this is not the greatest example of that, but let's go ahead and do it anyways, just because it's fun. So I said roll twice and use the higher. I'm not going to switch the camera over, you can see it. Just know that I am typing some digital dice in. I rolled a 1 and a 7. So the creator, Aberrant and Giant. Aberrant and Giant, that makes me think, so you have these aberrant touched giants. That's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool kickoff for just some sort of like far realm giants that are weird and unique. And I'm thinking an aberration flavor of like Fomorians, which are more of a fey corrupted or fey cursed giant. But if we turn around and use that as more of an aberrant one, maybe they have. It gets really Innsmouth vibes, where you have the town folk of Innsmouth who are kind of turning into fishy people, and having that maybe be the giants too. So already that sounds like a cool dungeon to run. These remains of maybe they're like giants that maybe they're like losing their bones, so they're becoming more cephalopod, like they're more like squid, octopus. They're kind of becoming invertebrates. And maybe they got some tentacles and stuff, and because that's classic Lovecraft aberrant stuff. So you can make a really fun dungeon. You're like, oh, who are these people? Where are they from? What are they doing here? Good kickoff for adventure, and makes me want to know immediately more about them. So other creators. So these are basically just our primary 5th edition 2025 5.24 because I like that and I want to use it more. 5.24 D&D. Different creature classifications, monster classifications, basically. We have aberrations, celestials, dragons, elementals, fays, fiends, giants, humanoids, monstrosities, plants, undead. And then 12 is none/unknown. And for this, I put like a cave system, inside a whale, etc. The dungeon could have no ancestral creator or occupant, or they could be strange and alien creatures beyond the knowledge of people. The latter is helpful if you want to make a very strange and inhuman dungeon. So these are just the monsters that we know about. So if we have some sort of monsters that are maybe third-party monsters, or we have some other cool idea, maybe we could throw stuff in there and be like, make it extra weird. I'm feeling very like Aliens series kind of stuff, like the Giger Geiger kind of stuff, where very organic feeling stuff, but it is clearly constructed and just weird and alien. So, I mean, you could classify that under aberration. Aberration's already so loosey-goosey. So, might be a little bit more helpful to, like I said, roll 2 results and throw them together. And then you get things like our squid giants. Or Innsmouth giants. Alright, with your result, answer these dungeon creator questions. Who are they? One creature, a family, group, an entire faction. So if we think about our squid giants, is it one squid giant or is it a bunch of squid giants? It could be cool to have it just be one squid giant, like this is. This is some sort of far realm touched creature. They reached out. Maybe they're like an old warlock giant, and they reached out and they touched something beyond the veil of understanding, and it's corrupted them, and they've built this dungeon for something. I like that. What are they doing here? Why did they choose this specific location? Yeah, what is their purpose here? So we're gonna get that in just a second. How did they build or co-opt the environment to their purpose? So, like I said, one of the things we said is we could do like the fleshy walls thing. That's a super easy go-to. Maybe they filled it with like maybe there's some plane into like elemental water, and we've got maybe we're gonna go for aberrations. Maybe we're gonna go sort of a aboleth vibe for a giant, which would be really cool. So they're giant size, so they're already large, and they wanted salt water. So in the dungeon, so they've created this contact to the plane of water that's filled this thing with this briny, like sea water, ocean water, and so for the humans to get by through it, like almost all the passages they go through are half sunken, like half full of water, but that's half full of water, like up to the waist of a giant. So they're like 10 feet, every room's about 10 to 15 feet deep in water, depending on the size of the giant. And that is now something that the players have to deal with as they go through the dungeon. It's like, oh, there's just going to be a ton of swimming in this dungeon. Or maybe there's specific areas you want to do if you don't want to do a full swimming dungeon. If you have a bunch of people in your group that have heavy armor, a bunch of swimming is going to be real bad for them. But if you want that to be difficult for them, you can do that. It works out really, really well. But if you are unclear on the creator's purpose, I have a D8 little purpose generator. Like I said, sometimes it's helpful to roll twice. So I'm going to roll twice, and we'll talk about what is our squid giant doing in here. Well, I rolled a 4 and a 4. So they're manufacturing, producing, or resource gathering facilities. So they're either making something or getting something from here. Uh, Maybe it's both. Since I rolled 2 4s, they're getting something here and they're crafting it. Maybe there's some sort of specific crystals here. That's a good nice go-to one. That's a very far realm thing. Some sort of like dream crystals. They're processing. They are cultivating and processing dream crystals. I'm thinking almost like a psychoactive substance that maybe they use. Maybe that's what they use for like their astral. They were using for like astral projection. Maybe they're using it to. If we wanted to do something else, maybe the crystals slow their transformation or expedite their transition into more like squid kind of guys. So we can go a lot of different ways with that. I do like this sort of like mind crystal that gives them the ability to sort of like astral project or maybe go into the astral sea, do things like that, because that seems like some. I'm basically making wizard cocaine, and I know that, and I'm okay with that. And they're just gonna. It's going to be coke, so it's ground up crystal that they're going to snort, but it's going to have more psychoactive effects on it. So it's more. It's not necessarily like cocaine. So they're going to get a different effect of it, but I think the transmission of it is the same. So they got to take a little bump or a rail or something, and then they're gonna fly off into space with their mind and make contact with dread horrors. Uh, I like that. I like that a lot. It's already a very weird dungeon that they're going into that has a really cool story attached to it. Oh, hey, Mars Anonymous. A dungeon purpose you used twice already is a portal. Specifically, it had more than one exit in a vastly different place. Yeah, I've both run and played in a dungeon which kind of focused as almost like a Stargate kind of thing. There was a hall basically of doors, and the doors went to different places. Though it was more of a rotunda. It's a rather than a hall. Wasn't straight. It's like a rotunda, so it's a circular room with a bunch of doors in it. But yeah, it's a very great thing, especially if you want to do especially a campaign that hops around to a lot of different places. Like if you have a lot of different ideas for places to set adventures, both in and beyond the material plane. Yeah, doing something like having a portal based dungeon that's kind of like a go-to place. Maybe they can turn it into a base themselves. And it's really cool. It also makes it very easy to attack your player's base because they have a bunch of doors to a bunch of different places in it. So it works both ways, which is really nice. So you can always threaten their NPCs and such. All right, Squiddy Giants. Moving on. So let's talk about the dungeon purposes in general. Home and settlement, they just live there. 2, fortress, they've got soldiers here for some reason. It's strategically important, maybe. There's a temple, they're worshipping something here. We already did manufacturing, production, and resource gathering. Some sort of work facility, basically. A vault, and then a D6 type for the vault. A haven, and this is just kind of like subdivisions as to what your vault is got in it. It's a haven, it's protecting creatures from the outside world. It's a prison, it protects the outside world from the creatures within. It's a secret repository, it protects information from outside people trying to get to it. A sealed repository, it protects outside people from the information within. That's like a doomsday book device kind of thing. It's like, nope, we got to build a big vault around this thing so people cannot get in to get this thing. We do not want them to have it. It will bring ruin. It's a ruin maker. A secret reliquary protects the object from the outside, and a sealed reliquary protects the outside from the object. It's nice to have like information. Like information could be a cool thing. Like a sealed reliquary or a secret reliquary is something that's where the Lich keeps their phylactery. That's a secret reliquary spot. And a sealed reliquary might be like, oh, this is something where we put maybe something like Black Razor or the Hand of Vecna or something like that. Something we know is incredibly dangerous, and we don't want people having it. So we put it in here. Information can be a really fun one. So if you do a dungeon to get like a Fey creature's true name, that's where they hide it. They hide the information of their true name, like maybe because Fey are weird, and all extraplanar creatures are weird and inscrutable by, I think, normal mundane creatures. Ideas of rational and logic, they don't make sense, and that's kind of the fun of them and what makes them very scary. So being like, oh no, they have to have their physical name somewhere written down. They can't just not have it. It has to be discoverable. Like that's one of the things that gives them power as Fae is their name, and that name has to be real and in the world. So if you have to go through a Feywild dungeon to get to the center to get this Fey creature's name, or maybe they've put it off on some sort of pocket plane that you have to go to and delve, Indiana Jones style, and it's just a fun dungeon that's got probably a bunch of weird stuff in it because it's Fey oriented. And at the end of it, I'm imagining like the Skyrim like dragon wall. And you just walk up to it, and it has like the name written there, and then it's sort of seared into your mind as sort of a word of power that you can now command this Fey because you know its true name. Already wildly different dungeon. Sounds real fun. Based off of what you're doing within in the campaign, that could be really, really fun. Dungeon inhabitants. All right, so we know who made the dungeon. We got our squid giant, but who's in here now? While the dungeon creators are the original architects or occupiers of the dungeon, they may not be alone. Actually, the creators may no longer be in the dungeon at all. However, nature abhors the vacuum. Other creatures will move into the location and co-opt it to their own use. Roll a d3 to determine the number of inhabitants or blocks or factions in the dungeon. Roll in the 1d20 in dungeon inhabitants below for each result. For non-creators, determine the purpose of the location. Use the dungeon purpose if you don't. Of course, if you have an idea, just use the idea. You don't need to do all the extra stuff. You don't need to roll for something if you already have a good idea. Just use the good idea. You should always use the good idea if you have a good idea. That's why we put it at the top of the document. All right, so we've got a few more things that are in here because one of the things you'll notice, not all the creature types were under our creators. Like beasts aren't under here. I could have added beasts if we were rolling them together, but I didn't here. But they are down here because I have the feeling that we don't necessarily need to be like, well, the dire rabbits built this war, and because there's not going to be a whole lot of lore attached to that because they're dire rabbits. But let's roll for our how many we got. I'm going to roll a d6 in spite of a d3, so I got 2, so we're going to have 2 dungeon inhabitants. Who's in here? All right, I rolled a 3. There's dragon in here, some sort of draconic faction, and a 17. So the dungeon creators. So Squid Giant still here. Now we might change things up a little bit, and depending on how long this dungeon's been here, maybe they're not necessarily alive anymore. or maybe they're extra weird, like something else has kind of taken over possession of them. Maybe whatever their aberrant creature that they were tied to in their sort of warlock pact or something like that. Maybe they've attached to it. Maybe they're just undead now. We can switch it up a little bit if that just to make things weirder, or we can keep it how it is. But there's also some sort of dragon faction here. So we're going to assume that they probably don't necessarily like each other, but they might. One might have captured the other, or maybe the dragon has swooped in and sort of taken it over. Now, there's a bunch of water in it, so that kind of tells us what kind of dragons might be in there. We're looking at greens, blacks. Um, those are sort of our primary ones. There are some other minor coastal dragons that we could look at that might make sense. Or if we wanted to be really fucky, what we do is we put a blue dragon in there who's got lightning breath, and in a dungeon that's half filled with water, lightning, and they're immune to lightning, so they can breathe lightning on the water and make it a bad day for your player characters, which means you could throw a pretty low level dragon in there. You don't have to throw a high level dragon in there for it to be a challenge because they can just electrify the water that all the players are in, which is you know, it sounds like it could be a pretty cool fight. I'm thinking like maybe a multi-dungeon chamber kind of fight, like between different chambers, because it can electrify a lot of water. And so maybe it's like trying to get to the thing, but also trying to get on dry land. There's a lot of interesting things we can get to, but that's really sort of like zooming in a lot as to individual chamber challenges. And we're not really quite there yet. We're still percolating on a lot of stuff. You'd add ghosts slash echoes of the original creators to that list for my own. Yeah, I can see that. Uh, I think generally that's what I look for undead being in there. That's potential because the undead have to come from somewhere. So my assumption would be that the undead are the creators or some other inhabitants who have come in. I know in the dungeon I'm running right now, the original inhabitants of the space, there are undeads of them in there. There are remnants of them who are alive. Like you said, echoes of the original creators. They are definitely there. As well as constructs who are in their own right kind of echoes of the original creators because they're from the original creators, but they're still functioning, but very similar. Yeah, I like that. So our dungeon inhabitants. Dungeon factions don't need to be monolithic. Dungeon inhabitants can also include allies, pets, tools, and other creatures affiliated with the faction. For example, a faction of Dwergar could include Darrow, Steeders, Dwergar, constructs, and Grimlock slaves. Similarly, a schism can split dungeon factions into different subgroups with different agendas. So one of the things that you see, and this is very much an older school D&D idea, kind of brought in from the older school. You don't see it as much, probably, I think, certainly fourth edition going forward, but sometimes in a lot of third edition, I feel like as well, where you don't see a lot of multiple factions butting heads with each other in a dungeon. Whereas you look at something like the original Keep on the Borderlands, where there's a ton of factions in the cave system, and none of them particularly like each other. And there's a lot of things you can do as a player character group is go in there and have social RP with one of the factions to be like, hey, can you help us defeat this other faction? And they'll be like, yeah, absolutely. We hate those guys. And we will absolutely use outsider help to help us get the advantage over them and take their space. So you can do a lot of that. So, but I actually do like the idea that maybe the dragon is not not necessarily an ally, maybe a pet of our squid giant. Just because I think that's more interesting than having just a dragon and a squid giant fighting over this dungeon. I think the one is maybe sort of like it almost enslaved. I'm thinking like mind slaved into it. So like the dragon's going to have like maybe some sort of like control collar or something on it. So there are ways to get around it, or if you're able to figure out a way to get the collar off, you maybe don't necessarily have to have combat with it. Maybe it becomes a more of a social RP encounter with the dungeon instead of a dungeon with the dragon. The other part of D&D with the dragon instead of immediately going into combat. So there's an option, a tricky way if you want to get around it. Maybe sneak up and unlock it, or maybe you have a really good social interaction, or some sort of magical way to get around fighting a powerful dragon. I like that. Already giving us options for the dungeon. And then it becomes the dungeon faction's not monolithic. It starts off monolithic, but it gives you the ability to create division within it, which I really like. So now the dungeon's not static, like it's active, like stuff can change in it. The factions can change and how they interact with each other can change based off of what the player characters do within the dungeon. So it's very dynamic in that way. Missing dungeon creators. Well, we don't have missing dungeon creators. Our dungeon creator is here. But the dungeon creator is not representing your dungeon inhabitants. You might want to figure out what happened to them. So, what is the fate of our missing creators? I'm just going to roll randomly, even though we know our creator is here. What could have happened to our squid giant? A 6 and a 4. Planar influence. I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, we already know that they're riddled with aberrant energies. And number 6, sealed or shrouded with guardians. Ooh, somebody came in here and sealed them up. That'd be really cool. Maybe you can have like some mind witnesses or other sort of other slave aberrants who are there to protect this sleeping, like a sleeping giant that's in here. That makes sense, and maybe that's why you have our collared dragon that's in here as well. Maybe it's filled with a bunch of subservient creatures, and you have all your classic aberration monsters that are running around in there. You can have a beholder in there, but some type of beholder in there. You can have, like I said, mind witnesses, something like that would make sense. Or what's some other good aberrants? Some chuls, I think. No, chul might be monstrosity. I think it's aberrant, an aberration. Stuff like that. You can throw a lot of weird stuff in there and have them be, kind of being like mind slaved by our squid giant who's in this sort of like torpor state. Maybe the squid giant himself is encased in one of these aberrant crystals. That's cool. Or maybe they're just like crusted over with them. Maybe it requires their body to grow because we know that they've been using it to like crush up into essentially drugs so they can dive into the astral plane. Or maybe they're on such a big hit or that they have been traveling the astral sea now with their mental projection, astral projection for who knows how long. And maybe they're really not at all cognizant of what's going on in the world. Maybe they're covered in like spider webs and stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff that we could do with this. That's the idea with these tables. It gives you an idea of cool stuff to do. That's the whole point. So, unfortunately, our creator is there, so they aren't missing. But if the missing creator was, then like maybe they're just like completely out of it. But ours, right now, we're going to go with them being awake and well. We could have them being on an astral projection when the PCs show up to the dungeon. That might make more sense. So it doesn't. There's not immediately a giant who runs out and squishes all your player characters and be like, oh, they're already like mentally projecting. I'm thinking I'm thinking about Cyberpunk because I'm playing Cyberpunk, the video game, 27 to 7. Like when you have somebody who's net running and they're just like kind of out of it, so you need a guard around them because they're not aware of the stuff that's happening around their body, their corporeal form, because they're all mentally projecting off. So dungeon condition. Knowing the condition of the dungeon is vital to knowing the balance of tricks and traps versus obstacles and hazards to include its challenges. Types of challenges help to reinforce the age and upkeep of the dungeon from its introduction. So it's a cool thing. So it really will make your complex feel very different. I like to use complex as an example. So let's say there's a big difference between like you walk into the remains of this, let's say, elven garrison, fortress, and small town that we're extrapolating to be a dungeon itself that's abandoned in the jungle. There's a big difference between it being like fully overgrown, like I'm thinking Last of Us style, where everything's covered with plant life as the nature sort of reclaiming this structure, and there's going to be like a lot of debris that falls down, a lot of stuff that breaks, stairs that fall underfoot, those kind of things in disrepair, or in this ruined sort of fortification and surrounding town. Or maybe it's imperfectly serviceable, and these are evil Eladrin that are here, and you guys are breaking into for whatever reason. We don't know what the MacGuffin. You make up whatever the MacGuffin it is that you want to put in there. Why they need to go here. So you might go, oh well, I need them to go get this item, which we know is in this jungle fortification that they're protecting, because we rolled a vault or whatever. So let's roll for ours. Like I said, I'm doing just all the off camera rather than switching to look at that document, but just know I'm just using the Google Dice roller. Let's roll just one, I think, because it doesn't really help us to roll twice on this table. Six. Of course, it's six. Which is uneven wear. Roll condition for each dungeon level or zone. If you're only doing a one zone dungeon, a smaller dungeon, roll it individually per chamber. Which is a nice way to be it. Like the wear and tear on this dungeon is wildly uneven. Some places are totally ruined, and other places are close to pristine. But I'm going to roll again. I'm not sure that that makes sense for a dungeon that's going to be basically half full of water. I think it's going the wear and tear on this should be probably pretty consistent. All right, I rolled a three, and that makes sense. So three for a living squid giant that's in here, but it's also a place that's covered in water, and they spend a lot of time projecting in astral play, which means that the dungeon condition is okay. So it's about a 1-to-1 ratio of tricks and traps versus hazards and obstacles. There's places where that are getting run down, and there are places that are still functioning as expected. I'm guessing that the places that are closer to where the squid giant uh, essentially goes unconscious so they can astral project, probably the tricks and traps work a lot better there. But maybe further towards the entrance of the dungeon, natural decay has kind of taken over, and there's a lot more hazards and obstacles. Maybe there's some nasty quippers or other sort of fish creatures that have made their way into there because we know there's some connection to the elemental plane of water, which helps with us going with the aboleth idea of an aberration because they are native to the plane of water. I believe so. I believe that's where they're from. So that all works together very, very well. It's important to note obstacles and hazards can include decaying and unstable tricks and traps. Think of them like unexploded bombs. The fact they don't work properly can make them even more unpredictable and dangerous to adventurers. This is a really easy way to do it. So if you want to roll for a trap, let's say that you have a trap that shoots, I know something super easy like it shoots fire bolts at people who walk across the. It has like an arcane eye, and every time that its sensor picks up somebody moving across there that it doesn't recognize, starts shooting at people. But now, if it doesn't recognize anybody, it shoots at everything, or maybe it just shoots all the time, like just randomly scatter shot. And that can be make it even more unpredictable because you're like, it doesn't really matter how well I hide or if I go invisible or anything. This thing just does like an area effect now, and there's just a chance I'm gonna get hit as I go across as it fires just randomly down this hallway or whatever, wherever you place it. Uh, it also means that it'll be very difficult for somebody like a rogue to disarm the trap because the trap's already not working correctly. So maybe that's where the wizard kind of steps up instead and can do more like arcane checks to like turn this thing off. Or something like a dispel magic would work. It's important to note obstacles and hazards can include to get. I already read that. Don't read the same thing. I've already read it. All right, completing our dungeon setup. Using the above section, you should be able to connect the dots and weave a history for the location, the creators, and current inhabitants. With some practice, it becomes natural to weave this history into the layout, function, and presentation of the dungeon during play. Think of ways you can show, don't tell its background to the players in your descriptions. So we already came up with a pretty good idea. We've got our squid giant. They're here. They're collecting. They're harvesting and They're harvesting these far realm crystals and manufacturing them into some sort of uh, pharmacological aid that they're using to achieve astral projection to get closer to whatever aberration creature they have made ties with. This could be like a giant warlock maybe of an old one pack or something like that. It could be a lot of different things. I sometimes it's nice to leave these empty spots in the dungeon. You don't have to 100% know the history. You just know. For me, I would probably be okay with that. That's set up. And then if the players show that they're interested in learning more about that, then I'll start to think a little bit more about it, and then leave myself open to improvise a little bit as well as listen to what my players' theories on it might be, because maybe they'll have a good theory. They'll go, yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I'm going to use that. And so that way I can crowdsource ideas a little bit, and then anytime you do that, the players always feel really good, like, I guessed it right off. It's like, you sure did, because it didn't exist until you brought it into being by saying it out loud, and then that became the thing. So leaving myself plenty of sort of wiggle room in the dungeon, especially in the story. But to have a strong idea as to, oh, there's a creature here. They're here for a reason. I understand what that reason is. Now I know why the other monsters are in the dungeon because they're there to protect this giant, and they've got this mind controlled dragon that they mind slaved. So you have that stuff in there, and you're like, oh, well, now that's super interesting. All right, where did I leave off? Show them, tell them the background of the players through your descriptions. Yeah, so you want to show it rather than tell them that. You're gonna be like, oh, you find out these crystals, you see all these crystals here, and you see them being this giant mortar and pestle, like giants, literally giant size. They're crushing it up into, and maybe you find information about sort of the mind slaving caller and stuff like that. There's all these things that they can investigate and find out rather than you just telling them directly. Be like, let them investigate and figure some of that stuff out. Just when you do this, because this is a pro tip from somebody who's done this a lot, uh, be okay if they don't come up with it. If they decide not to investigate, you just kind of have to be okay with that as a dungeon master. Be like, oh, you're not going to check out that stuff and get greater context of what's going on. Okay, okay. Now you can still like give them some pokes and prods and some hints. But if they are clearly not interested in investigating what's going on, yeah, don't push that. That it doesn't feel good when you're a player and the DM keeps pushing like their world in your face and be like, pay attention to the world I made. Like, I know, buddy. I'm just trying to play D&D. I'm just trying to play the game and play my character and kill some orcs and have some fun and have some role play and have some chuckles. And your world's fine. I didn't make your world though, so it's not as important to me as it ever will be to you. So just kind of be okay with that as a dungeon master. For me, I like to frame that as the world building stuff is the stuff that this dungeon aspect helps me run the dungeon, but more importantly is where I get a lot of the joy out of it is understanding, okay, now I understand a little bit more about my own world and these creatures within it and what's going on in the world. That's a sense of sort of enlightenment for myself, but I don't expect my players to get that same joy out of that experience that I do as a dungeon master. So, our dungeon setup questions. What's the creature's inhabitants need to survive and thrive? Well, this guy probably needs some source of food, but maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's fed through the astral realm. Maybe as a giant, he's incredibly sickly looking because he doesn't use his body a lot. He spends most of his time astrally projecting. So maybe he's like super sinewy and gaunt. He looks unwell. I'd say they look unwell because we don't know a gender for this giant. It's not particularly important. Uh, so they're very gaunt. They look malnourished, like they don't spend a lot of time. And I think the stuff that we find in there is like really basic, like stone ground oats and stuff like that. Like they don't take a lot of pleasure in sensory material goods because they're hyper focused on that astral aspect and connecting with this aberrant far realm creature and energy. So that's the thing. They're very hardcore, like addicted to it. That they very much just want to spend all their time in that thing. And anytime that they come out of it into the real world is very much like a letdown. It's not a place that they want to be. So there's stuff like that. Yeah, and they're gonna have like chamber pots and stuff like that. So that's all we need. We need to make sure it's like, oh, can they get water from somewhere? Is there some place where they can eat? Can they take a poop somewhere? That's helpful to know. Where your creature's pooping. It's helpful to know. You would be probably surprised how often that comes up when I'm a player. When I'm like, yeah, but let me check those poops. It's come up for multiple characters. One of them, one time, to find out that they're checking a chamber pot to find that there's no poop in that chamber pot from a creature that's supposedly been living in this place for a while by themselves, and be like, there's no poop in that chamber pot. You something weird. You are not what you look like. And that's true. They end up. One of them's a ghost, and one of them ended up being like a demon or something like that from a different plane. Like, there you go. The proof is in the poop. So you always got to check the poop. But what a weird tangent to go on. I play D&D a little weird sometimes. So we know that why are they here? What they need to survive and thrive? Who or what will serve as a quest giver for the dungeon? Yeah. Why do we need people to go? Why do we need our friends to go into this dungeon? We can come up with some sort of like MacGuffin they could be going after. Maybe somebody in the town, maybe multiple people in the town are having their dreams invaded by this creature. They're having these terrible, terrible nightmares of some sort of far realm monstrosity, and maybe they can see uh, a shadowy visage of a giant creature, and they're like, "Well, giant creature, we know that supposedly there's a giant that used to live in the hills, but nobody's seen that creature in a long time. But all of a sudden, this entire town is starting to have just horrific nightmares about an aberrant cosmic horror kind of stuff." And they're like, I mean, and seeing, like I said, silhouettes of maybe like a giant squid creature. They're like, well, the only giant creature we know of is that thing that's up there. Can you go check it out? Just find out what's going on with their dreams. Maybe that's it. That's the problem the dungeon's causing for the quest giver. And the quest giver is like the town. Very simple one. We could also do something that's like, somebody who knows the dragon's there. Maybe a druid wants us to go free the dragon because they've heard the dragon's there. They've heard the dragon cry. And maybe they can mentally connect with the dragon, or they've seen it flying around and they've tracked it down and tried to talk to it, recorded it at some point, and then got blasted really bad. And maybe we can have them be like really hard, like lightning scarred or something like that, where they've been trying to get a hold. If we go with the blue dragon thing, because they've been trying to get a hold of this blue dragon and they haven't been able to. So now they're like, well, adventurers, I could use your help. I think, and of course, being like a druid or dryad or something like that, they'll be able to offer some sort of nice recompense for doing it. Why hasn't anybody completed this quest yet? Might just not be adventurers around. Maybe you're the first adventurers in this area. Uh, Also doesn't mean that why maybe the people we've sent before didn't make it back. And so your team too. That's very common in D&D adventures. Be like, yeah, we tried sending people. You're not the first people we've asked, but those people did not come back. So we know it's a little difficult, or we know it's deadly, or whatever. They took the pre the upfront money and ran with it and decided it was too hard, or whatever. We can decide to do that. Go down that route if we want to. And what quest rewards will the player party receive for their completion? Let's say if we go with the settlement will probably give them gold. Maybe they have some sort of specific item. Maybe they know about something that the giant is rumored to have within their den. They're like, oh well, it's giant, and they're yeah. You might maybe it's super vague. Like they're known to have some sort of ring of power, not knowing that this has been distorted through the ages to be like, oh, that's the mind slave collar that's on the dragon. They're like, oh, they have supposedly a ring of power. So everybody's going to think this ring, but really it's like a manacled choker kind of situation. An iron necklace, the band that's around their neck that you have to break up. It'd probably be like silver or something, just a little bit more magical. Maybe it's even weirder, and it could be just made out of this crystal. It would probably just be made out of those aberrant crystals. That makes more sense. So it's this cool, like, I'm thinking like full one-piece amethyst band that goes around. That maybe just trying to get that thing off is a challenge in itself. Maybe that's a cool rogue wizard challenge for people to figure out how to get that thing off the dragon if they decide to go that route instead of fighting and killing the dragon. So yeah, that could be the reward, their promise. They could also just give them gold. The druid could give them potions or scrolls or a cool magic item that they have. Maybe they can awaken one of their, if they have an animal companion or not a familiar, an animal companion, or maybe a potted plant or something. They can awaken it. Maybe that's a powerful thing they can do as a sort of a powerful ritual to say thank you. It could be a cool thing they do. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of options, so it kind of depends on whatever way you give out characters' rewards. I've got a different table for that I use, because I also like to give out things like licenses or grants or charters of land, and I try not to just give players money, just straightforward money, because money just either gets immediately spent, generally on potions or scrolls, or just kind of gets held onto, especially in sort of 5.24 game style, is there's not a lot to spend money on because there's no magic economy outside of potions and scrolls. Because the way that we set up the edition is that there's no way to just really go in and just buy a magic sword off the shelf or anything like that. So it's really difficult to get the money out of the economy in video game terms. It's easy to get money in, but it's hard to get money out of the economy, out of the player's pockets for anything. That's why we see. I think we see a lot more of the sort of backstream rules and stuff like that in 2024. Give us a player sink for the money, and because it's fun to have the base. So yeah, that gives us already a pretty good completed dungeon setup. I think the settlement will give them some money, and I think there is this rumor of a ring of power or a ring of command or something like that. Yeah, it's a ring of power, or a ring of command. I think that like if they don't know that it's not a finger ring, they likely don't know that it's a ring of like mind control. So yeah, I think I'm happy with that. I think that makes sense. And we've got a cool start of a dungeon. Our dungeon setup's pretty much done. Our dungeon setup seems cool. At least I think it's cool. That probably makes sense. I made the document. So it would be weird if I didn't think it was cool. Hopefully you think it's cool and you see sort of the merit in this sort of approach. Let's move on to dungeon chambers and stocking. This section represents the meat and potatoes of the dungeon building process. It includes well-established advice on how to create fun and fulfilling dungeons for your game. You will determine the scope and the size of your dungeon. Afterwards, you will create the elements of the dungeon chambers by determining purpose, contents, difficulty class, and dressing. And then we have just a little snippet here on 5-room dungeon design where I just kind of talk candidly about it. The 5-room dungeon is a popular method for generating one-session dungeons. It features a strong and simple design philosophy. If you are a new dungeon master, I recommend looking into this method for generating starter dungeons for your game. I think, especially for brand new DMs, I really, really like 5-room dungeons. They give you a little bit of everything. It gives you a way to scattershot a bunch of different stuff at your players in a few different sessions really, really quickly. And that gives you an idea. As a dungeon master, it gives you a lot of practice really quickly on building and running dungeons, which is super useful for figuring out how to do it. No better thing than experience. So the faster you can get that experience, the faster you can fail in it and get the experience, the better it's going to be. Your game's going to be. Second is they take about one session, so they're super easy to churn through, which is really nice. So you're not stuck if you get into a dungeon and it turns out you don't like it, or your party, your group of friends doesn't like it. You're like, it's just this one session, and we're moving on from it. So you don't have to worry about that. It'll also tell you about which of the encounter types that your pillars of the game that your players seem to really focus in on. Are they really excited to get to combat sections? Is that the games where you have a fun combat that they're like, oh, well, this is a really in-depth combat, and they're like, oh, that was lots of fun. We definitely want to play more stuff like that. Or it's like, oh, I really loved that NPC that was in there, and we had that long, 20 minutes of just talking back and forth to them and learning about them and their place in the world, and then getting them to come along as a little buddy. Are doing that? And now I know, oh, okay, they're a lot more interested in sort of the social RP side, so now I can throw a lot more of that kind of stuff at them. Or are they more interested in doing puzzle rooms and figuring out how to get across a chasm in the middle of a room, a bottomless pit? Like, how do they get across that? And they were like, oh, it was so fun to be like, oh, well, I don't have fly, but maybe I'll cast Featherfall and jump, and so I'll jump and then Featherfall, and that'll give me enough of a parabola to get all the way across, enough momentum to get all the way across the chasm, or having the druid that can wild shape into a spider and crawl into a giant spider and crawl along the walls and ferry the players over to the other side and stuff. When they're like, oh, it was really fun to come up with this really clever solution. Now I know they're really into the exploration investigation side of the game. So doing that really early on really helps a lot, and I think 5-room dungeons are really, really good for many reasons for brand new dungeon masters. Now, that said, dungeons using 5 rooms and challenge types become quickly predictable for players. For dungeon masters looking to branch out, it's recommended to follow the simple dungeon instructions below. So this is the sort of the meat and potatoes we're getting into. This is how I say to kind of build a simple dungeon. And dungeons that I've had a lot of success with. So to create a simple dungeon, create only one zone or level, and stop creating new dungeon chambers once you reach a boss monster. That's 7 total creature encounters, so this makes a somewhat sizable dungeon. And monsters are going to show up in about, your creatures are going to show up in about, was it 1/3 of rooms? So that could be up to 21 rooms, but unlikely to be that high, and you might even bring it down a little bit. So how big should your dungeon be? This is a good concern. This is a thing that doesn't come up in a lot of the dungeon building stuff that we've looked at before. It's trying to tell you when. Basically, the only advice had been 5th editions and 4th editions were basically until you fill the piece of graph paper that you're using to map your dungeon, your random dungeon. 4th edition had one extra one where they were like, oh, until they get through about 7 encounters, which is very similar to this, 7 encounters, which is essentially one level of play for 4th edition. So that gives us a little bit more framework. So when we're thinking about building a dungeon, we think about, okay, how long do we want to be in the dungeon, and what do we want the aftermath, the outflow of the dungeon to be? So let's talk a little bit about that. Luckily, RPGs have the gift of being make-believe, which means a dungeon can be as big or as small as suits our needs. To determine the size of your dungeon, consider 2 pieces of information. Number 1, how many dungeon delving sessions do you want to run? How long do you want to spend in this dungeon? Do you want your players to spend in this session? Number 2, how powerful do you want the player characters to become? The more time they spend in there, the more XP they're going to get. Luckily, the more amount of levels they're going to get. That's if you're using XP leveling, which I don't. But still at the same time, oftentimes when you come out of a dungeon, you're expecting to probably come up a level if you spent some significant time in there. So we have a little bit of a rubric to help, because this top part is sort of the vague information that I feel like we get in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. They're like, oh, to determine the size of the dungeon, how many sessions do you want to spend here, and how powerful do you want the player characters to become? Do you want them to level up in the dungeon or not? Do you want them to level up multiple times in the dungeon? And then that would be the end of its advice. And you go, that's great. How do I determine that? So that's a cool idea, and it gives me a lot of what, but it doesn't give me a lot of how, which is what I'm looking for in a guide book. So we have a little bit more information for you, especially for new DMs who are trying to figure this out on the fly. So 4.5 rooms serves as a good approximation for the amount of dungeon progress the average D&D party makes in a typical 3 to 4 hour gaming session. So yeah, in 3 to 4 hours, they're going to make it. Basically, it's about a room or encounter for about every 45 minutes of play. So consider that. That's sort of it. So if you want a one-shot dungeon, keep it small and err on the sides of linearity and easier challenges for encounters that you can get through. You don't want to throw a whole bunch of hard encounters, because hard encounters take more time at the table, which means it's less likely you're going to get through multiple encounters in one sit-down session. So rather than only have one combat encounter, just have like 2 or 3 really small encounters that are really easy, and maybe one like medium to kind of end it on. And that gives you the ability to do a lot of different types of encounters in a smaller scope rather than fewer, larger things, which can feels like they get more accomplished in a dungeon. Another good measurement tool is the 5th edition's intent for XP-based leveling. According to the DMG, the party is expected to level up about every 4 sessions. That's about every 18 dungeon chambers or so, if you're just running a straight dungeon crawl. That's something to think about. So, like in the dungeon that I'm currently running, there's only 7 rooms. I'm looking down, like I have it in front of me. I know. I believe it's 7 rooms. It's a 7-room dungeon. So, looking at this rubric, that's about a little over a third, closer to 35 to 40% of what they need to go up a level. But I'm not using this rubric, and my players are already frustrated enough with me that they haven't leveled up. But they're so close. They're right there. Like I said, once they get through the dungeon, they're going to level up. And they're right there. They're right at the tail end. Like I said, this is a 7-room dungeon, and we're going into the 4th session of the dungeon crawl. So they've been slow. It's been slow. They've come across a lot of trouble. They've had to double back. They've had to take some rest. They've had to things that did not go well for them very early on in the dungeon, but they have adapted. They're doing a much better job now crawling through the dungeon. And they're like, hey, we should maybe keep a map of the dungeon. Hey, let's check the ceiling for monsters. I mean, all the sort of stuff that you start to learn as a player who does a lot of dungeon delving. But it's also cool to see that change also happen from as player characters in character from these characters who didn't know anything about dungeon delving. And now this is technically the 2nd dungeon that they've gone into and now they're starting to learn from the mistakes that they've made over the past, which feels very diegetic. It makes sense. Makes sense that they're like, oh, we had this terrible enemy attack us from the ceiling, and that combat went really really poorly. So now I'm checking ceilings, baby. When I'm walking in, the room looks plain. I check the ceiling. What the heck is up there? Uh, Doing those sorts of things. Looking for, we had a player look for secret, a secret passage or secret room, and they found something. So seeing that sort of grow organically. So yeah, every 18 dungeon chambers or so. I have not looked at 20. I don't think I updated this for the 2024 rules, but I assume that they are probably very similar as far as to how often you're supposed to level up, which is about 4 sessions, which feels about right. So we know how small we can make the dungeons, but what if we want to make the dungeons like real big? Creating mega dungeons. It's helpful for dungeon masters and players to break big dungeons down into different levels or zones of dungeon. Each zone should have a distinct theme, feel, or gimmick to it, and a central challenge, like a tough combat encounter, like a mini boss. It's recommended to keep individual zones to a maximum of 12 chambers. The more distinct the zones, the easier it will be for players to remember where they are in relation to the overall dungeon. And for clean examples of effective dungeon zones, review video games in the Metroidvania genre. If you really want to see how that's done really well, just go look at a Metroid game or look at a Castlevania game, or games that are like Hollow Knight that are built in that same sort of area, and they'll give you zones, how zones connect, all those that sort of information. It'll give you a lot of really good ideas, um, and how to cross between different zones and what that looks like, and how to make each one feel very unique and individual. So for ours, what size we're going to be make our dungeon? For an example's sake, we're going to say I'm going to stick around what I usually do. I really like about a 7-room dungeon. That's sort of my personal sweet spot, because I think with efficient dungeon delving, it's about 2 to 3 sessions of play most of the time. Now, our current group has gone a little bit longer, but not much. They're only going to have a little bit of an extra session because they're right at the end of the dungeon. So it's going to take a little bit longer for them, but not by much. Like I said, with efficient dungeon crawling, you can get this down to easily 2 sessions. If you're really super efficient, if you have a really good crew of dungeon delvers, you can probably get through a 7-room dungeon pretty easily in 1 session, depending on how much time they spend and what kind of encounters they come across. But if you have a good dungeon crawling team that sidesteps a lot of challenges, that figures things out, that has some clever play, you can blow through a dungeon in one setting very easily of that size. But what if we want to make the big old dungeons? So yeah, basically a mega dungeon in its own right, because of the different zones, is basically you're just taking a whole bunch of little dungeons and then putting them together, like stapling them together, and that's the way you do that. And so zones makes this helpful. Instead of having to prep an entire gigantic dungeon, you prep one small part of the dungeon, and then figure out its connections to other dungeon zones or levels, and then that helps you think about the factions, what's going on in the dungeon that way, and you can start to think about, okay, how do the factions interact with each other? How do they feel about each other? And why did these creatures decide to set up shop in this one particular area of the dungeon? A classic example that I go with is maybe you have constructs and things like that in places where there's maybe like poisonous flora that's in there. So maybe you have a bunch of poisonous mushrooms that are in this cavern, like a cave system. You're like, oh, well, if you have creatures as one of the inhabitants of your dungeon that's immune to poison, they would set up shop there because nothing bothers them in there. Uh, the poisonous mushrooms don't bother them, and creatures that would come in to take this space from them are affected by the poison mushrooms, so they don't necessarily want that space. So it makes sense that this is where they've landed and this is where they make home at. You can do that. It's very similar with even creatures that have like resistances if you want to do Dwergar or dwarves or something like that. Elves that are like immune to things like sleep and stuff like that. Gnomes who have advantage against magical saves, magical effects, etc. You kind of look at the different types of creatures, look at sort of their vulnerabilities, immunities, think about where they would make the most sense in there, or how you can make the environment. You can customize it a little bit to the monsters that are going to be in the dungeon. So, creating dungeon chambers. With knowledge of how many rooms/chambers you want to include in your dungeon, it's time to determine the purpose of those chambers. Create a numbered list for your chambers and determine their purpose using the 1d20 dungeon chamber types below. All right, let's just roll a couple, just see what they are. And again, this is a really good. These are super generic for the most part, on purpose. I mean, they're to be able to be messed with, and that way they're very easy to tailor to the specifics of the type of dungeon you're trying to build. So for us, let's just roll 2 and slam them together, because I like to do that. So I rolled a 14 and a 9. So 9 is a display area. So this is like an art gallery or a hunting trophy room, something like that. Something where you show stuff off, essentially. And 14 is a recreation area. Okay, so a display area and some place where they do something. So a trophy room kind of makes sense that this is maybe sort of like a billiards room kind of thing. Maybe this is an entertaining room. Maybe it's like a little hall, even though halls are something that you can roll in here. And it does make sense that maybe like this is a place. Just like what would the Far Realm have? Maybe they have like all these. I don't want to do crystals. We've got a lot of crystal themed things for our squid giant. So maybe they have I would think it would be weird for them to have like stuffed astral aberrant creatures, but they could, which would be weird. It would be a fun room for the players to try to get into, and they're sneaking in and they see these stuffed versions of these strange aberrant creatures in there. But I think instead I'm going to have these. Maybe it's a room. You can really show off like maybe how addled this squid giant is. Is instead have a room that's like plastered with these like rough charcoal sketches of trying to remember things they saw in the astral plane, which is kind of dreamlike to them when they're projecting into it. So just a lot of cosmic horror stuff that they've tried to roughly sketch out that's very Cthulhu-esque in that way. And they're just like plastered around the room like a crazy person, like on the walls. I think that's a super easy way to do that. So that gives them a recreation, something they're doing in there. So there's got to be a workbench that has like a ton of these things on it, all over it. And you have to have the obligatory like page that just has like one word repeated on it again and again and again and again. Maybe it's some astral creature's name, maybe it's something to the dungeon itself. It might be the ring, or the collar, collar. So they're obsessively thinking about the dragon collar. Maybe they find schematics for it. So that kind of gives us an area. Maybe it's not strong recreation, but it does give us some sort of muted thing. It's a little bit more like a workshop, but that's okay. We don't have to follow these to the T. It just kind of gives us a jumping off point. So I like that. So I would have a room like that in the dungeon. The different chamber purposes are generic in nature. The generality is intentional so that you can divide duplicates into more specific purposes. For instance, duplicate private suite results can be turned into private suites for 2 different people. The results could also be creating it into a private study and adjoining bed chamber. So that way they're general, so that way you can get more specific when you have duplicates of the same thing. So you might have a food area which turns into a kitchen and a larder, or a pantry or a root cellar or something like that. So yeah, it's super easy, super generic. Then D20 roll chamber. You can roll it all together. It works out really well. I've never really had much of an issue with it, and it gives you a very easy thing to start to pull on things. Now, obviously, they don't all work for all creators of the dungeon because you have to keep those in mind. But these dungeon chamber types can not only just be what the room's first intention was, but the intention that it's been turned into. Like, for instance, let's say the crystal growing room. The crystal growing room, and we put this in Natural Cavern, but let's say, actually, let's use our Eladrin Fortress example instead. So let's say that I'm just going to roll 2d20s, and that'll give me what it used to be and what it is now. So I rolled a 19, a cistern or well, and a 5, a captive area. Maybe this is the ruin spot. So it used to be a cistern or well, but now it's a captive area. It's like an oubliette that somebody's been thrown into. Maybe they've just fallen down there. Maybe this is where an NPC is resting. Maybe they're an explorer that fell down this well. Maybe it's like a sinkhole or a cistern or something like that that got covered over by uh, vegetation and flora, and that person just fell into, which is a real thing that really happens in real life, and it's awful. So, you know, that's a terrorizing, a horrible nightmare thing to think about. So there are plenty of instances of old cisterns, usually for like, at least in the U.S., usually for like cattle watering. So it's a water collection point from used to have be attached to like a trough for cows to have water at. And then the farm goes out of commission or whatever, grows vegetation grows over the top of that cistern. Somebody doesn't know about it. They're just walking across the land and fall into the cistern. If they're by themselves, they're going to drown down there. They're just going to die down there. It is horrible. And we're going to move on from that because it's very depressing. But yeah, so you could throw these dungeon chambers types together and do that stuff. So a dungeon chamber DC. So one of the things I like to do is one room DCs. If you've watched the channel before, you know that about me, which is something I picked up from Index Card RPG, which is a really cool idea. So one room DCs is a concept borrowed from Runehammer and ICRPG. Next to each chamber type in your list, assign a DC. The DC represents the target number for any ability checks regarding the room. That means searching for hidden treasure, picking a locked door, climbing the walls in the room. They all use the same DC to determine that. So success or failure. So some rooms are just hard, and some rooms are easy, which is a very easy way to kind of do it. Now, one of the things that I would add in here, and I will probably do later, is that in addition to just having the flat number, ICRPG does basically a plus or minus 3. So if you can get into a situation where you're like, this room is DC 11, but the thing you're trying to do in this room seems specifically hard, I'm going to add a 3 to that. So now the DC is 14. Or the thing that you're trying to do, you have the right tool for it, so I think we should make it specifically easy. So we're going to take that 11, we're going to minus 3 away from it, and now it's a DC 8. So pretty easy to do. So there's still some fluctuation. You still have a little bit of tuning that you can do to change to dial this stuff in for challenges. But having the one DC is a lot easier than having maybe you have 3 or 4 different things that players can interact with in the room, and then assigning different DCs for each of those things, and then trying to parse that in your notes while you're running the game, while you're running the room, instead of just being like, there's one room DC. Everything in here is this DC plus or minus 3. It makes life pretty easy. So I highly recommend it. It's definitely changed the way that I prep dungeons, and I enjoy it a lot. Makes things very easy. I don't have to go looking for DCs for stuff. I just know what the DC is because I put it right next to the name when I have the chamber information, the information for each different dungeon room. It'll be like, oh, this is the Ancient Armory DC 12. And so I know everything in there is roughly a DC 12. Dungeon chamber sizes. Another important aspect of the dungeon chambers to consider is their size. Below is a handy table for coming up with dimensions of small and large dungeon chambers using a D12 and a D4. So, I'm going to roll a D4 and a D12. We're going to put them together. So, for the main, we're going to roll our 12 first, and then our 4. I should probably switch. No, I had it correct. So I rolled a 4 and a 1, so that's going to be a small chamber that is 20 by 10. So pretty small rooms. So I wanted to make sure I kind of split the middle as far as old school dungeon rooms and newer school dungeon rooms, which are very large, and old school, which are really small. So basically what I did is kind of made this flat way to make small chambers and large chambers. Let me roll a different one. Because I want a large chamber. That's small. I'm going to roll until I get a large one. Come on. 11. There we go. So I rolled 11 and 4. So that becomes a 60 by 80 area. So much larger. And these rooms are generally going to be rectangular in orientation, though you can make square. I leave it up to interpretation. I know in some of the earlier dungeon creation stuff we looked at, they told you the specific size. They're like, oh, this room is a square. This room is a circle. This room is a rectangle. This room is irregular. I like to just kind of leave that up to chance whenever I get it. So usually if I get something that's 11 by 4 that I roll, which is a 60 by 80, that's a big rectangle. But what I could do is just figure out how many squares that is really quickly, which I would need a calculator. It's 420 squares, right? 4,800 feet, but how many is that in squares? That's 5 by 8. So it's 40 squares. Sorry, not 42. 40 squares. I know. I'm wrong. It's 6 by 8. Nope, that's wrong. Man, math, not strong for me this morning. Uh, yeah, so that's gonna be 60. Yeah, it's a large room. That's all we need to know. It's a large room to do anything in. I need to put space in here. The above dungeon chamber dimensions assume a medium-sized dungeon creator. If a huge-sized frost giants create the dungeon, they would not be able to fit into a 10-foot wide hallway or chamber without squeezing. Huge-sized creatures are triple the size of medium creatures. In this case, triple the dungeon dimensions to provide appropriate sense of scale. So we said a giant. I was going to go just for scalability. We're going to make them large size, even though they should be larger than that. So they are 4 by 4. So this 60 by 80 is actually double that size. So it's 120 by 160. So it's a huge room. But that means that somebody with a longbow or firebolt or Eldritch Blast can reach all the way across the room. But your guys who are swinging swords, they're going to have some difficulty in this room. They're going to have difficulty in a full dungeon if you do it to scale. They got to get to stuff fast. So you're going to look at support things, spells. You're going to want a lot of support spells. Like for treasure in here, I might throw some scrolls of haste or things like that. Stuff to throw in there and give them the ability to move faster, have extra actions to get around stuff. To do that, to compensate for that, because it's no fun to always to be a sword and board fighter and feel like every encounter is halfway over by the time you get into the mix and melee. So you also want to put plenty of meaty melee monsters in there that are going to be able to that are going to be coming at the party too. Is when you're working at something at a scale like this, which you might have something with a fly speed, which can usually move pretty quickly around. Alright, so what actually goes in these dungeon chambers? You should now have a list of your dungeon chambers, the purpose, and DCs. Now start a second list with as many entries as you have dungeon chambers. This list will be used to record the room contents of the dungeon. Why we do this in a separate list will become apparent in the mapping and putting it all together section. So instead of doing the map first, I do a map last kind of style. Figure out how many rooms there are. I mean, I say that there are times in which I do the layout of the dungeon first. You can really do it either or. If you have a strong thought about the layout you want the dungeon to be in, or you have a map that you're pulling from, like an already existing map, like a Dice and Logos map, that you're like, okay, I need to prep for a dungeon. I want to use a cool map. I'm going to go grab this Dice and Logos dungeon. It's got 10 chambers in it. I just need to figure out what the 10 chambers are and key it out. So you might do it the other way, depending on how you go. I do it both ways. Sometimes I do the list first to try to figure out what the dungeon is before I start trying to put it together. Other times I do the layout first. It's really to your own preference. I suggest trying it both ways when you're making a dungeon and see which one works better for you. I feel pretty ambivalent about it. I feel like it works faster for me if I do the layout first, but I feel like the dungeon is sometimes better put together if I know what the chambers are and what's in them first, and then assign them to a map layout. So this is one of my favorite tables I have ever made. It is basically a riff on the old basic room stocking, chamber stocking rolls from. We kind of saw it in the DnDAdventure game, but probably best known from the basic box set. I think the Mincer box set with a D6 vision shaper roll. I didn't quite like how that was, so I riffed it and changed a little bit to make it a 2d6 roll. So you roll twice and then slam those results together. I'm just gonna roll. Let's just roll a couple, see what they look like. I rolled a 4 and a 1. So 1 is empty, and 4 is a hazard, obstacle, trick, or trap with treasure. So some sort of hot and a treasure. Now we had a 1-to-1 roll for our dungeon, so I'm just gonna roll a die. If it's high, it's gonna be tricks and traps. I rolled a 5 on the D10, which is low, so it's some sort of hazard obstacle in this room, but there is some treasure in it. And then what happens when you get duplicates? Well, let me see if I just roll some duplicates. It'll take me just a second to roll a duplicate, probably. There you go, I rolled a duplicate. I rolled a 4 and a 6. So a same thing, hazard, obstacle, trick, or trap with treasure, and then 6 is a creature with treasure. So there are duplicate treasures in this room. So that can mean that there's multiple of the same contents. Down here on duplicates, we just read it. The room may contain multiples of the same contents, such as creatures from separate factions, or simply more numerous or more potent results. For example, duplicate treasure results, which is what we got in this instance, can guarantee a magic item is loot, which is usually what I do. It's like, hey, if I roll 2 treasures in the same room, guaranteed one of the treasures that's going to be in this room is a magic item. Usually that's going to be just potions and scrolls, but I generally roll randomly for it. Sometimes I play stuff, but generally I roll randomly for the loot. But I know for sure there's going to be a magic item in this room. In addition to there already being a chance that magic items can show up in general loot. So let's move on to hazards and obstacles. They represent non-combat exploration-based challenges for your players. A good hazard or obstacle challenges players rather than their characters, and often requires clever play and use of resources to overcome. Below is a 1d20 hazard obstacle roll table you can use to help populate your dungeon with exploration-based challenges. Again, great one to roll twice on. Like down here at the bottom I have, for more unique hazards and obstacles, roll twice on the table and combine the results. Rolling a 13 and 16, which is a disease and a trivial monster swarm, vermin, might result in a vermin swarm carrying a debilitating disease. So if you want to add that, so you can do, what is it, filth fever, I think is the usual one, that is associated with things like giant rats. But there's a few other diseases that are hard baked into 5.24 and that you can use, or you can come up with your own, or it can just give you exhaustion or condition, or get loosey-goosey with it. You can make stuff up. You don't have to use something straight out of the book. So let's roll. That was an example one. Let's roll ourselves our own example for our dungeon, for our squid giant. All right, I got a 7, which is a permanent spell effect zone, and a 16, a trivial monster swarm, or vermin. Interesting. Permanent spell effect zone. My first thought was immediately magical sleep, because I was thinking a sleeping giant who's doing a lot of astral projection. They might want a permanent spell effect around them that also puts other creatures to sleep. Because if you have intruders that come in and then get put to sleep, the squid giant can immediately like jump into their mind and attack them that way, like psychically, which could be a really cool encounter. And maybe we make it its own sort of like, almost like Tron style fight, where it's like, oh, you guys are pulled to this weird combat arena that have been manifested among the endless stars of the night sky, sitting on a plane of grand nothingness, and you are fighting these creatures summoned by aberrant creatures summoned by the squid giant, as its sort of mental, psychological defenses, psychic defenses. So you do something cool like that, and that could be vermin of some type. That just means trivial monster swarms. So it could be some sort of like astral imps or something aberrant, whatever the aberrant version of something like imps would be, or methods. And just having a cluster of small creatures that are almost there more for reconnaissance for the squid giant to understand who's in the dungeon, as much as trying to kill them, or at least drive them off. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a difficult encounter. It could be, in fact, a trivial encounter. Just the goals are slightly different from the different sides. So tricks and traps are very similar. Unlike hazard and obstacles, trick traps were created with intention, but they are otherwise investigation and exploration challenges. Most common traps fall into one of four categories: alarm, detainment, lockdown, or murder. Tricks tend to be more mischievous, making them both less and more troublesome for parties. Below are 1d20 tricks and traps to help stock your dungeon. Okay, so we know that we've got this. That's right, it was a hazard. We can count that as an obstacle. The zone of sleep. So maybe the zone of sleep is just something that maybe it's like an aura that comes off of the giant. Just creatures that get close to it tend to start to get drowsy and fall to sleep. Like the overpowering effects. There's so much of that crystal dust maybe in the air that there's a chance that the player characters could just fall asleep just going through it. Maybe only part of the party falls asleep and gets attacked by these trivial swarms of. That could be cool. I like that. So they might not necessarily all do it, but then maybe if they can see that they're in trouble, because I'm sure there's going to be like physical evidence that they're being harmed in the psychic fight. As player characters who are still awake, you can choose to fail the save to go into the dream world. If you try not to fight against the dream takes you, and then everybody can show up in the psychic battleground. But let's move on to that makes a little bit more sense for maybe a hazard. But let's move on to our tricks and traps. So let me roll a trick or trap up. Again, we're going to roll twice and try to stick them together. I got an 11, a murder trap. That's just something that kills intruders. And the first four here are archetypes: an alarm trap, it alerts defenders, that's what it does. A detainment trap imprisons intruders. It's a classic like pitfall trap. A lockdown trap locks exits or prevents dungeon zone ingress or egress. So basically, this is the heist when somebody steals the jewel off the little pressure-sensitive thing, and bars come down over the doors. It's kind of like detainment, but not quite. It's really just trying to make sure that whatever it's trying to protect is not entering or exiting. So slightly different. And then we have our murder trap, which is, it's there to kill people. That's what it does. All right, but we rolled an 11, so that we got a murder trap, and 19, a teleportation trick. Let's see. So we know this dungeon is half soaked in water. We know that most adventurers don't breathe water, and I think that the squid giant would probably know that. He knows that most creatures that would be coming to fight a giant, probably don't breathe water. So I like the idea that maybe there's this teleportation trick that always, when you hit it, it takes you to the bottom of a room filled with water. So it's trying to maybe like actively drown them. So if you have somebody who's in heavy armor and they get forwarded down there and they can't swim their way out of the water, and now that becomes the encounter. I like that. I think that's super simple, very easy to pull off. It's something that is definitely trying to kill you, but it's not necessarily trying to do like hit point damage to you. Though we could do that. We could just teleport you into some place that doesn't want you teleported. So shunting damage or into some sort of clearly hazardous place. No, I like the idea of using the environment itself as the simplest way to get the result we want, which is to stop intruders from coming in, primarily by killing them, which is taking away their ability to breathe. So you come out of this pool, it keeps teleporting you maybe back down to the bottom of the water, hoping that you will either get so tired and from exhaustion you'll die, or that you will run out of breath. And maybe there's something nasty in the water too. We could always add that if we wanted to. In the one that we rolled where we had like a hazard obstacle, trick or trap, and a creature, that would be a good use for this room. And there's something in the water that they would probably have already known about. They tried to get around on dry land, but trying to get around on dry land across the chamber has teleported them into the water, the thing. And that's how we get there. With some sort of nasty, let's do like an aberrant crocodile, like something real weird that's in there. That'd be cool. It's set up that way. So yeah, super easy. And then we have some trap triggers: sensor and perception, pressure or touch, incorrect interaction, for example, giving a wrong riddle answer or something like that. Trying to punch in a key code and the key code doesn't work, and then the trap's set off. And then, the trap trigger has a reroll and a time delay on it. So maybe it's a pressure sensitive thing, but it doesn't immediately go off. It waits maybe a couple rounds for people to get like further into the room. So they realize something has happened, but they don't know what it is yet. And then once people get more into the room, maybe that's when the doors close and the room starts filling with water or sand or whatever. Trap reset, none, manual, automatic, time, automatic, instant. I think for something like this teleportation trick, I think it's just automatic, probably instant, maybe timed. We might do timed. It's definitely not going to be a manual reset. It could also just be none. It could just be a permanent thing that's just always on. That it doesn't really need to reset. But I do like the idea that maybe there's an automatic timed aspect, so even if they don't have somebody in the party who can figure out how to dispel or disable this trap, there's always a chance it's like, oh, well, if we set off one person to set it off, then that gives enough room for maybe one person to run by the trap and get to the other side. And so now they can brute force it that way and come out that way, which could be very interesting. Or maybe they could do something funny with like their familiar, using their familiar to set it off, and maybe their familiar doesn't breathe, or they change their familiar to something that can survive underwater. And then after that, we're gonna move on to creature encounters. Hi, RPG Grandma, how you doing? So we're going to talk about the creature encounter. So this uses a 4-2-1, sort of like a step pyramid kind of style that will get us to the 7 encounters that we want to do if we're going to focus on making that simple dungeon where we're going to end basically with boss monster. So use the information in the section below to determine the difficulty of your combat encounters and or neutral creatures in the dungeon, because creature encounters don't necessarily mean combats. It just means that they're coming in and there's creatures in here. So this could be the place, like we said, if you have that collared dragon who's been mind slaved by our squid giant, you can come in there and be like, it's a creature encounter, so it's not necessarily we have to fight it. There is opportunities to get around fighting it and get to it that way. So the information in the section below to determine the difficulty of your combat encounters and neutral creatures. These creatures can be part of an established faction or a third party that has wandered into the dungeon. This is a good place if you want like a trader who maybe trades with the dungeon factions, and maybe that's an easy way, a neutral person they can talk to. If they have some health potions on them, useful information, useful goods they can talk to, get some information out of, that kind of stuff. If you want to add plenty of that into your dungeon. If you want to make it feel like it's a real ecology, there is somebody who travels through here and maybe knows some stuff about it, but is not an actively aggressive to you as adventurers coming in. You could also make a competing group of adventurers that's present in the dungeon, which is a fun one too. If you have rival adventurers. Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. I'm doing all right. We're jumping in. We're talking dungeon creation. Always fun stuff. Going through my personal document. Catching up from last time where we looked at some of the other official D&D stuff throughout the years as to how to make your own dungeon. So this is sort of my take on it. It's a chunky boy, about 24 pages. We're going through pretty slowly, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, but it's kind of a deeper topic, and I want to make sure we get through it. So we'll be here for a little bit. So I think I am probably going to have to take a break in the not too distant future to refill up on some drinks. But not quite there yet. Let's get through creatures at least. So the CR difficulty of creature encounter uses pyramid weighting. This weighting helps to ensure that there are more easier encounters with lower CR monsters in them, and fewer higher level encounters that could easily lead to a TPK. Below is the order of adding encounters, and it repeats basically every 7 encounters. That's why for a simple dungeon, we have 7 creature encounters in it. 1 normal creature encounter, 2 normal creature encounters, a special creature encounter, a normal creature encounter, a normal creature encounter, special creature encounter, and a dungeon zone or mini boss. So in our simple dungeon that we would be making, that boss would be that would be our boss monster for the dungeon. And then we just have some basic ideas about how to set up the difficulty. You have trivial, which is -2 to 4 levels under the party's APL, the average party level, for their CR, to use that to tune it in. I like changing the difficulty of dungeons based on average party level rather than easy or hard. That's just how it works for me. I like to just dial in hard CR most of the time and then change it by levels. I've found, especially in 5e in 2024, that helps me make a better distinguishing between an easy fight and a hard fight, as opposed to just using the dials that are in there between an easy, medium, and hard encounter for that party level. I feel like there's a larger range, and it feels a little bit more like how I want it to feel. You just got to be a little bit careful because you could very easily overwhelm them if you're not super confident in what you're doing. So always err on making things a little too easy rather than a little too hard. It's easier to make things harder on the fly. It's a lot less easy to make things easier without it really seem like you're pulling your punches sometimes with DM. So we have trivial encounters. An easy encounter is -1 party level CR. So obviously, if you're running first level characters, first level party, you can't do -2 to 4. So you just have to go with sort of that easy trivial scaling instead in those aspects. And so those are normal monsters. So trivial, easy, medium encounters. Chambers only for our special monsters. Our normal monsters can be in the chambers and as wandering monster table, which we'll get to in a little bit. Special monsters only show up in chambers. And those are medium, hard, and deadly encounters. Most of the time they're going to be at the party level, +1 to the party level, +2 to 4 at the party level. You'll see that there's some asterisks down here we need to pay attention to. Talked about it right underneath. Be careful when pulling monsters from other adventure tiers beyond the party's current level. These monsters are balanced for significantly stronger or weaker PCs. So when you cross through, like our level bands are 1 through 4, 5 through 10, 11 through 16, 17 through 20. So if you're running a group of 9th level characters to this dungeon, and you pull something that's going to be a CR 11, that's actually in a different tier of adventure, so that monster is balanced for parties of 11 through 16, which means more attacks, more cantrips do more damage, those sorts of things, higher proficiencies, higher to hits, higher saves. So consider that you need to be very careful when you're going to cross those bands of tier levels. Instead, when you're looking at something that's for a, let's say you need to make an APL 11 encounter, instead of using an APL or a CR 11 creature, or a creature that would be appropriate for that party level, use something that's appropriate for the levels that you are, just put more creatures into it. And do it that way. So that way their scale works a little bit differently. You can nerf a monster above them. Yeah, you can. Absolutely. If you're willing to put in the work to like go in there and get fiddly with the numbers and you feel confident in doing that, yeah, absolutely do that. The dungeon I'm running right now, I've got a custom monster in it that I'm running. But I had to sort of like dial and make it yourself. But yeah, it is one way to do it. I think it's easier from the dungeon standpoint. If you're building stuff out of the book, you need to pay more attention about what you're choosing if you're not willing or you don't feel confident to go in there and start fiddling with the numbers yourself. But yeah, you can always change them. Custom monsters are the best. They are the best. You are correct. But if you're using stuff out of the book, you need to be very careful because they're going to be balanced a little bit differently. You're not going to make those changes. Make sure all dungeon factions are represented in the dungeon's encounters. Include the main monster type plus any allies, pets, etc. The aid, so we know that we have to have our dungeon encounter in there. We know that we have to have our squid giant encounter in there, and we need to know that we're going to have their mephits or whatever their aberrant servitors are that they use for at least that dream sequence. If we're going to the dream fight, psychic fight, if we're going to include that. So that gives us an idea of, okay, now I'm starting to think about what monsters I want to put in here. You're terrible. You fiddle and tweak. Yeah, no, I think fiddling and tweaking is fun. Uh, I enjoy doing it. I like making custom monsters. I think they're fun. I think they're more fun to play at the table because the players uh, aren't familiar with them, so they don't know all their tricks yet. They don't know all the cool stuff they can do yet. So I agree, but it is hard to not fiddle and tweak with them, especially some of the 5e 2024 monsters and how they're made. You always want to futz with them a little bit. So, no puzzles. You might notice now that we haven't included puzzles in our anything in here. So why is that? So TTRPG puzzles are kind of divisive. Some game masters and groups really love puzzles, and others loathe them. I kind of fall in the loathing category. I'm not a huge puzzle fan, and I think because the inclusion of dungeon puzzles is very much a matter of taste, I didn't include them here. But you can add them to the dungeon. I'm not saying you don't have them in your dungeon. I'm saying that puzzles often require more dungeon master prep time and energy than other challenges, and they're best implemented by experienced DMs who design puzzles specifically to the agreeableness of their group's taste. Like, I can't tell you how well your group does puzzles and what kind of puzzles they enjoy. So it's very difficult for me to put that in a guide. Whereas something where, unlike combat, where we have a lot more rules and structure around that, a lot more mechanics around it, puzzles we don't really have a lot of that. So it's going to be dependent upon you and your agreeableness of that. If you want to include puzzles in your dungeon, you can substitute one in place of a 2d6 dungeon chamber contents result of a trick or trap. I think that works pretty well. Or you can also do hazard or obstacle if you want to. Because of the nature of puzzles, provide a means of circumventing the puzzle. This is the important part. Provide a means of circumventing the puzzle to avoid a bottleneck dead end. That means that you get to a point, and I think we've all experienced this at DMs if we've done it for a while. We set a puzzle in front of our players, and then they can't figure out the solution, and they don't know what to do next. So instead of feeling like, oh, we futz around with it for 20 minutes, and then I just kind of end up giving them the answer to it because we got to move forward in the dungeon, is to either make sure that there's not a bottleneck, there's another way they can get to everything in the dungeon without having to go through the puzzle door. Presumably it's a doorway, because most puzzles are doors. Or you need to give them a way to find the solution. For me, I like to include it as one or more of my pocket content treasures, like treasures that you just find on bodies, like stuff you would pull out of somebody's pocket. That includes like a puzzle clue or a full solution. I like this if you have sentient monsters in the dungeons. It's really easy to pull off. Where you're like, oh, there's always like Todd. Todd is like the real dumb bugbear who, for whatever reason, just like cannot remember the combination, the answer to the riddle at the puzzle door. So he just literally has it written down on a piece of paper in his pocket. Now, without context, if they haven't come across the puzzle door, they're going to pull this note out of this bugbear's pocket and be like, why do they have lilac written down? What does that mean? Why is there a random flower written down? But then once they get to the door, if they find it first, they're like, oh, yeah, obviously. Okay, the answer is probably lilac. Right? That's why this guy had this written down. That makes sense. We think that the riddle's probably referencing a color or a flower or something like that. So we're like, oh, yeah, no, lilac. That should be what it is. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Ghosts and undead, harmless to lethal, are a must in a dungeon. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of undead. It's harder once you get into higher levels, though, because so many of them then start to actually be immune or resistant to turn, and that's kind of the cleric's one thing. So I don't like that aspect about them. Also, sometimes they do it in other ways. Populate with a collection. I find fun. Oh yeah, monsters. Yeah, and calculate which party level should be appropriate. Oh yeah, if you want to backwards your way into it, if you're just making a dungeon without a specific group in mind, yeah, you do it with monsters you find fun, and then work it back into it. Populating dungeons based on a per dungeon ideal party level, not the actual one. Yeah, they can access it early if they dare. Yeah, if you're running more of an open world style and you're just dropping dungeons in the world, yeah, absolutely. That is a little bit how I tend to run, and where I'm like, oh, you guys are third level. You can try to go into the fifth level dungeon, but you guys will. I'll try to make it telegraph it very early on that this is beyond your ken. This is way too powerful for you guys. So you could find something if you're brave enough to get in there. You can find some probably really nice magic items that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. But it also comes with a lot of really super deadly monsters that you're really not prepared to handle. Yeah, puzzles are hit or flop. You put a pattern on the floor of the first room, I'm pretty sure they will all think it's a trap. Yeah, that's pretty common. I fully suspect they will go full Mission Impossible trying to cross the floor. Yeah, foreshadowing. Yeah, foreshadowing, leaving hints around what might be lurking is fine. Yeah, I find it because I don't want a puzzle to bottleneck or bring an adventure to a dead end, where it's like you have to get through this door to get to the other side. And if you guys can't figure it out, then I basically have to give you the answer if we want to keep playing, or you guys have to leave. So finding another way, either by creating a loop in the dungeon, the layout, which means they can get to everything even if they didn't go through that room, which is what happened in the current dungeon that I'm running. There is a sentry point. So there is a hard sentry point that has locked and barred barred gates on each side, and inside there are now 4 clay soldiers, and they're of a mind. The players are of a mind. I've put it in their minds that this will be a very difficult fight if you try to fight these guys. But the thing is that it's just one stopgap in the hallway. There's a full loop. It's part on the loop, so you can go the full way around the dungeon and get back to that room. And they did, and they found the room on the other side. And they're like, "Oh, okay, so we've made a loop. We've gotten back to where we started." That makes sense. Very similar. All right, so let's finish up our puzzles. And that was everything I wanted to say about puzzles. So now we're going to go on to our dungeon treasure. Every good dungeon needs plenty of treasure sprinkled throughout. The load tables will help you decide what treasure and how much to include with each parcel. It's recommended to make a treasure roll for each member of the party to include treasure parcels. So I will say that the way that I run a pretty low wealth game in general. So this can be hit or miss depending on how gold happy you are as a dungeon master, how treasure happy you are, how many times you give it out, and to do those things. So for me, I tend to give out a lot of not straight currency and usually in pretty small denominations. And adventuring is a poor man's work, and then occasionally you run in, basically you find a windfall. You're like, and then occasionally you roll really high, and they find a stash of gold. Like our players just found a pretty sizable. I think the largest treasure parcel they've come across so far in the campaign, and it was hidden away. And one of my players rolled really well and noticed there was a secret cubby in that room. Otherwise, they were going to miss it. But luckily, they found it. And they found some healing potions and some other good stuff in there, too. A missive, a letter they cannot read that's written in a script that one of the players can recognize, but they can't read it, and they realize they can't form any clear words out of it. Which is that's just a little hint. And that's probably coded. It's written with a cipher. You're going to have to figure that out. So, that's the idea there. But let's talk about our dungeon treasure. So I like to do a treasure roll for each member of the party. Let's just as an example, let's just do one character. All right, I rolled a 16. They're just going to get straight currency. That means we can go past the pocket contents and stuff. To our treasure amount, I'm going to roll another d20 and then a d20 after that. All right, so I rolled a 17, so it's a d100, and I rolled a 12, so a d100 of silver pieces. I rolled very low. They get 6 silver pieces in the treasure parcel. I feel bad. I might roll higher on that just because I know it's a D100. That's better. They get 98 silver, which is still like 5 gold. Or, sorry, about 10 gold. So it's not a ton, but it sounds much larger than 6 silver pieces and worth a lot more than that. And don't want to grind them into the dirt too much and feel like adventuring's a bad idea. Adventuring's a good idea. It's just a lot of the times you're going to pick up not great rewards, and then occasionally you're going to find a really nice reward. Let's do one more because I want something that's not currency, because currency is the easiest thing to give out. I rolled a 3. That's pocket contents, which takes us to our next treasure trade book. So the treasure types you can roll: pocket contents, trade goods, currency, or magic items. So there's a 10% chance with this roll table that you're going to get a magic item anytime. So if you have 4 people in your party, you're going to get magic items pretty regularly when you come across loot. Most of the time they're going to be potions and scrolls, consumable kind of stuff. But occasionally you're going to come across some wands. You're going to get some magic weapons. All the classes. We're going to do all the hits. But what is pocket contents? It's a type of treasure. Pocket contents represent the everyday carry type of items. One's likely to find in the pants pockets or belt pouches, and the items are rarely of high resale value. So we said, like, this is where I put things like, oh, the bugbear's got the lilac message in their pocket, in their belt pouch. This is where I add stuff like that. So let's roll a d6, find out what kind of type I got. I rolled a 6, some sort of personal item, a flask, a key, a bit of medicine, something that's tied specifically to them. Maybe some sort of like thing, good luck charm, something of that nature. Something that's personal to them. It's maybe not practical. Other things that fall under these guys is you can have accessories, everyday carries, food, money, paper, personal items. So what does that mean? Things, mittens, personal religious items, daggers, tools, handkerchiefs, instruments, candy, dried meat, nuts, seeds, copper, silver, gold, platinum if they just have some pocket money, a banknote, which is money, but it has an extra step in there because you have to basically cash it like a check at the bank. Some sort of clue, right? Or a map. So sometimes I'll get out a partial map of the dungeon or something of that nature. Or if we have some sort of puzzle in there, we give them clues for the puzzle. Or something like one of the clues I might put in there is be like there's a big underlined section that says remember to feed dragon. Oh, cool, there's a dragon here. Now I know that. um, and stuff like that. Yeah, leaving multiple ways in and out is always good. Yeah, I always try to add, and we'll get there a little bit talking about multiple exits and entrances. Always try to have at least two in my dungeons, so there's always a place for the players to sneak their way in a different way than the front door, and a way for my bad guys to run away if I have the predilection for them to do that. If they're usually most of my bad guys are very interested in self-preservation, so they'll run if combats get too bad. And this gives them a way to run out of the dungeon, at least one other way to run out of the dungeon, which is super helpful. I think how you award XP probably has the biggest effect on what you reward as treasure. I think that's true too. Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're playing like real OSR style where gold is XP, very different. But yeah, I mean, if you it depends on how much leveling you're doing as to how many magic items you go. Because you're going to have to give out more magic items if you're going into higher levels, because the party's just, your fighters and stuff like that are going to need the magic items. Because you get to a point, especially in 5e and 2024, where so many of the monsters are resistant, sometimes even immune to non-magical damage, bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. So you're like, you got to give them magic items. They got to have some way to deal damage, or else they're already less powerful than they already are from spellcasters. So it's like a double nerf on them if you don't do it. Speaking of patterns, you put a point care. This model of the tiling of the hyperbolic plane. Oh, okay. Subtle hint: the dungeon would be non-Euclidean. My, that's a pretty deep cut for for a clue. I like it, but that feels like it's very. Somebody's gonna have to know some maths to get that. Uh, you need. I'd probably at least let the wizard, if not somebody else, throw an intelligence check on it to understand what the thing is that they're looking at, uh, or to be able to understand its context of it. But yeah, no, that's a cool one. I do like that. It's just like that's a deep cut. That's something that I would put in my dungeon and be like, maybe I need to take that a step back just to make sure that people can actually get the clue part of the clue or understand it. But yeah, that is very cool. They found out soon enough, anyways, once their map started getting weird. Yeah, yeah. This map don't work right. What's going on here? Well, the dungeon's playing by a different set of rules than you're thinking. All right, currency and trade good values. Currency and trade goods represent the most likely types of treasure the adventuring party will find in the dungeon. Currency is simple enough, but trade goods require transporting back to civilization, selling the goods to an interested party. So there's a lot of extra steps that I've kind of put in here. You'll kind of see that. Like things like the banknotes, like trade goods. I want to put an extra step in there. And so it's not, you don't just get money, and sometimes getting the treasure out of the dungeon is sometimes a challenge. If you're like, you found this, like, let's think of like Greek style Hellenistic period marble statue. And you're like, this thing is worth a ton, but it's a massive, heavy marble statue. How the heck do we get this thing out of the dungeon and get it back to town? Like that becomes a little challenge in and of itself. And sometimes they're like, we just can't. Can we hack off one of its arms and we'll take that back because that's going to be worth something? Yeah, sure. You got like a hand sticking out, kind of looking like this, doing the little like very willowy kind of Greek style statue pose, just sticking out of the back of your backpack as you're walking around in the dungeon. Doing something like that, you chop the head, you break the head off of it, and take the head off, and you're like, we didn't take the statue, but now we've got a very classy bust that we can put up somewhere in our bastion. Keep it for themselves. Or maybe they just want to identify who the person is. Maybe they didn't roll well, and they'll take it back and they'll figure it out in town. But yeah, sometimes just getting the goods out is a challenge. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is because I want the overland aspect of my games to have a little bit more importance. So I don't give out a lot of bags of holding. So instead, I'm like, oh, well, you bring a mule with a wagon, mules with wagons with you, and you can put stuff in the wagons and take it back to town. But then you also need somebody who watch the wagon and the mules while you're in the dungeon. So now there's a hireling. So now you're getting money out of the economy that they have to pay people and buy stuff and pay for the feed of the animals. And then do they want to get armor for the animals? That sort of stuff. Trying to get money out of the economy. The other aspect is I want it to feel important to have somebody in the party who has good charisma, because every time that you take these trade goods back to town and try to sell them, you're going to have with somebody to buy them. So then it really shines when you have a sorcerer or a bard or somebody else who's even a paladin who's got a pretty decent charisma score, and be like, oh, I'll take care of selling the stuff. And because we have this person in our party, we get more gold out of treasure when we have it, as opposed to being like, oh, well, you find this thing and it's always worth this. So instead, there's this fluidity to it, and different kinds of characters bring different strengths to it. And now it makes sense why you might want to have something like animal handling or land vehicle proficiency, because you got to get these things out of here over rough terrain. So it really helps to have somebody who can drive a wagon well, who can get you from the dungeon back to town when it's loaded down with stuff, when you're not going over just straight roads. What do we got? Lost my place. Where are we going? Hey, you just have them draw maps. They usually make mistakes. They think the walls are moving or something. Yeah, it's mapping is a skill, and it's not a skill that I think a lot of today's common players have. I had a player who just started trying to map out the dungeon that we're in currently, and they were struggling with it a little bit. They were like, "Oh, I put the room on the wrong side." Yeah, you did. That makes sense because they were like, how does this dungeon loop back on itself? This doesn't make any sense. It's like, oh well, you put one of the rooms in the wrong spot, so you think the loop's in a different spot than it should be from the starting point. The owner of this banknote can exchange it for 20 gold from Krugrash, the Defiler, or Warlord. Kind of banknotes are nice too. Yeah, that's what I meant by banknotes. Yes, very much like that. You can take it to a certain person. A lot of merchant stuff that I come across, these are like pre-bank mints. So it's basically a checking account or bearer bonds. Be like, this piece of paper is worth this amount of money if you take it to a place. But you can also just sell it to other people, and they'll take it as legal tender. But they may not pay you the full bank's note because they're like, yeah, but I got to cut off like 10% because I also still have to take it to that place to get the actual coinage. But it's a heck of a lot easier to carry around paper money than it is a whole bunch of coins. So that's why they use them. Yeah, at least a lot of other RP challenges and stuff like that. No joke ability stats make all of them useful. Exactly. Yeah, that's what we're looking for to do. Like, hey, you didn't bring anybody who has charisma with you? That's a real bummer when it goes to sell treasure, when it comes to making friends in town with important, and power players who are in the settlement or political affiliations. If you guys struggle with that stuff because you don't have somebody who has pretty good charisma in it. In the same way that my current party that I'm running for, they're all city kids for the most part, and so they don't really have a lot of wilderness survival stuff. Now they've gone to a new island where they don't know anybody or know anything about the island. They're doing a lot of wilderness exploration survival, and it's been a real pain in the butt for them. Like they really feel that sting of being like, man, like not having a ranger, not having somebody who has good survival and good tracking and animal handling and stuff like that makes this. We really feel the pain of not having somebody like that in the party. None of like you can't make it right. It's not that you can't be successful. It's like things are just a little bit harder because you don't have this particular type of person with this particular type of skill that would be really useful in this specific circumstance. And that's what I try to hone in on. So there's a little bit of reward when you have that thing, and a little bit of pinch when you don't. Just so that everybody feels like it's important to have a well-rounded party. Put it that way. To determine how much currency the party receives, the market value of trade goods. You roll on the tables we already did. So, for fun, let's do a trade goods roll. I got 10. Furniture or tableware? Fun. This one comes up often enough, about 5% of the time. 12 and 10. So, going to be worth a D50 of silver pieces. Okay. Only 12. So you've come across maybe like a nice copper plate or something like that, like a beaten copper plate. You're like, it's worth 12 silver, so I mean, we can huck it in the backpack, but it's not gonna. We're not gonna be buying mansions for the rest of our life off this sort of stuff, and that's kind of how my D&D treasure tends to go. It's like there's a lot of scavenging. Like this is stuff that's worth a little bit of money, but altogether it'll be worth something. And then every once in a while you get something that's going to be like worth. I'll roll really well. I'll roll like 2 20s, and I'm going to be like, oh, you're going to find a D100 platinum pieces, and you're going to find let's see how many platinum 92 platinum pieces. That's 920 gold. Like that's a big swing from 12 silver to almost 1,000. It's a big wide range, but it's rare that they come across those windfall things. It's also important to remember that the way that this is set up is to roll once for every basically player character in the party. So every time that you have treasure in there, you're rolling on this, 4 or 5 times most of the time. So you're gonna find a bunch of different stuff in the room. And of course, you mediate this to somewhat because it might not make sense why there's a copper plate in this dungeon room, whatever the room tends to be. So that's why I try to divorce the chambers and what I'm stocking them with, so then I can just kind of like piece them together, what makes the most sense where. That's just the way I do it. You don't have to do it that way, but that's just the way this guide is set up to allow you to do that very easily. All right, so I'm just gonna read off the trade goods real quick. So arms, armor, ammunition, art or decorations, bone, horn, or pelts, books, non-magical scrolls and writing supplies, building materials, clothing, coffee, tea, tobacco, containers, flour or grain, furniture or tableware, gemstones or jewelry, herbs or spices, ingots or ore, livestock or plants, medicine, narcotics, preserved food, religious items, textiles, and tools are kind of the things that I have down as the general trade goods that you're going to come across. Um, so let's say I was just rolling for a handful of adventurers, let's say 3 adventurers, and they all rolled trade goods. So what trade goods would they find in this room? They'd find one of them finds flour and grain stash, one of them finds some narcotics, and one of them finds some gemstone or jewelry. So it looks like maybe somebody's like campsite, a personal campsite or something like that. Maybe a hidey hole that they've hidden their drugs and jewelry in, and a light snack, or maybe some emergency rations. This is like a little cache that they found somewhere. They've squirreled away. And then we have our magic item. I do it rarity by party level, and then just roll a d20. So let's say got a group of 5th level adventurers, so 1 through 10, that's common, 11 through 16, that's uncommon, and then a rare item on 17 to 20. I'll roll a d20. I rolled a 5, so they get a common item. So that's probably going to be a potion, 1st level spell scroll, something like that, most of the time. And to find out for sure, we can do the magic item category, which again is weighted a little bit. I rolled a 15, so something with charges. So a common thing with charges, so it's probably going to be a wand, so a wand of either a cantrip or a 1st level spell. Hey, a wand of cure wounds or healing word is super nice to come across. That'd be a really nice one, especially if my party that I'm running for or expecting to run for maybe doesn't have a super strong like cleric or druid healing character in it, and then you need a little extra heal. I might just toss them that. Or it might be something else. Mage Hand's a fun one that you can use if you don't have somebody in your party who has access to Mage Hand. Having a wand with a few charges a day that you can use Mage Hand on can add up for some fun shenanigans that your party can get into. And then just some treasure and location, which is again just a little 2d6 table. So this was found in a chest or coffer, and it's locked and or trapped. So maybe it's just a locked coffer, so a big like trunk or a reinforced trunk that's got the stuff in it. It's locked, they need to get into, or maybe it's trapped. Maybe it's got a little poison needle trap on it or something. Uh, Now, I don't usually interpret it this way, but trapped in this context could mean like, maybe it's a mimic. Always could be a mimic. Probably not. I try not to overuse mimics because then players, it's like traps in general. If you throw a mimic at them, they'll start to think, or some sort of animated object, and your players will start to get really paranoid to think that everything's going to jump out and attack them in a room. Like, no, it's just the one. It was just said the one time. You'll be fine. You don't want to overplay it. Dungeon dressing. Dungeon dressing represents a flourish of atmosphere. For your dungeon, the below roll table has some general dressing items you can use to add a little extra decoration and feel to your dungeon to make dungeon chambers feel more diverse. What was one of the dungeon chambers we came across? I always like the trophy room. Right? Oh, that's got all the weird scribbles of aberrant creatures on it. So we might go, all right, what's in this room? So I'm going to roll 2d20 and put it together for dungeon dressing. A 14 and a 20. Some benign fungus, mold, ooze, or slime. I might interpret this to be more crystals, the crystals growing on the walls, but it could be some sort of ooze or mold or slime. The important part is that it's benign. It's dressing. Mildew. Actually, mildew probably makes the most sense. So it's really nasty mildew and mold that's in this room. Because like half the rooms have water in them, right? They're up to halfway with water because our squid giant needs to stay moist. He needs to stay damp at all times. And then number 20 is a key. There's a 10% chance it fits a lock in this dungeon. Sometimes you find the key and it's just a key and you don't really find anything to it. But there's a chance that it's going to fit into something here. So now we said that we might go back to our coffer that we had that had that stuff in it that we just rolled for. That we said could either be locked or trapped. Well, now we can just go, oh, it's locked. And we'll do that, and then we'll take this, and there's a 10% chance. And then, of course, we can always hand wave and be like, yeah, obviously, if they get to the squid giant and they get the key off the squid giant, obviously it's going to go in the locked box. But if the key is in the same room that the treasure chest is, it probably doesn't go to it. I wouldn't quite make it that easy because at that point you're like, why do you even make it locked at all? Unless you're doing it because it's a mimic or trapped, and it's a fake key. But that's a bit cruel. That's a bit overwrought as some sort of a trap. To be aware that by describing the dungeon dressing, your players may decide to interact with the dressing or assume, because you mentioned it, as players do, it is integral to completing the dungeon, which is not. It's just dressing. For this, you may want to consider what answers to provide once they begin asking questions. For example, if you have a campsite remains in a chamber, players are likely to investigate and ask questions like, how old is the camp? Can we tell who made the camp? Did they leave behind anything useful or valuable? Use these interactions as opportunities to enrich the dungeon narrative, or to explain something about the campaign or setting to your players. Like in the current one that I'm running, they came across a ruined armory that's got a broken corner in the room that goes out to the marsh that's outside, so it's partially flooded. So that's a second entrance in and out of the dungeon. Now, they found some wet footprints of webbed humanoids. Kuatoa, Swagan, Bullywugs, anything. They didn't roll a good enough nature check to know for sure. But it does seem like this armory has been ransacked before. And there's sort of residual camp. Now, they can investigate the campsite there a little bit. If they rolled better, they unfortunately didn't. They would have recognized that, oh, this is actually pretty old. It seems like the true answer, if you're a player, why are you watching this? Stop watching this. I'm talking about you. Cover your ears for a second. It's not important. It's just fun. So you don't necessarily know what's going on. The idea is that it's an old Swagan camp. They came in here. It's a little shelter for them, out of the way from creatures that might attack them. So it's a place they come to every once in a while. They camp. They sleep here. And they found it, and anything that was useful here as far as like weapons and armor in this armory, they've already taken a long, long time ago. And this is the thing that they use occasionally. So nobody here now, nobody in the dungeon now, but gives them idea and provides context for the rest of the world. Oh, by the way, you as players should know, and your characters know, now that there are Slogan around, like in the marsh and stuff. So you know that there are aquatic humanoids who could be creatures that you run into that might attack you or not. Those sort of things. So it gives you the ability to kind of provide some context and some world building and add a little bit of the setting for the players. So that's what I'm looking for out of my dungeon dressing for the most part, is to enrich the narrative a little bit. Ever put a town inside a dungeon? Yeah. Have I ever put a full town? Now, like I said, I've extrapolated some stuff and made a town a dungeon in its own way, in sort of like a point crawl kind of way as an adventure. Have I ever put a full town inside of a dungeon? I don't think I have, just generally because the scale of my dungeons are usually smaller than that. And to put a full town in there, um, I definitely made dungeons that had towns in them, but they're usually ruined. There's usually not anybody living in there. Usually it's an abandoned town, like in the Underdark or something like that, and that is the dungeon itself. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I've definitely put like traders and stuff and people, not traders like AITORS, like traders like people who give you goods and services. Definitely put traders in dungeons before. Like, hey, here's a random person you can talk to, or a random group of people you can talk to, uh, who have stuff that they can sell you. They might need your help. They might give you a little mini mission inside the dungeon because they're looking for something. Maybe that's why they're in here. Stuff of that stuff. Lots of sketch sorts, but resources too. Yeah, there's a lot of different things that you can find in here. Or finding a wizard running a store in the middle of a dungeon. Yes, yeah. I do have a recurring NPC in my world who is more of a demon type of creature who you can summon, who functions as sort of like a magic item store. You can summon this fiendish creature, talk to you. Thing is that he doesn't take gold; he takes other stuff. So he trades for stuff like, oh, sure, I can give you this powerful +2 sword, but I am gonna need a point of your Constitution score for it. Ooh, I don't know if I want to do that, especially if it's something that's maybe gonna take some hit points away from them. If they're 5th level and they're like, if I give you a Constitution point, I'm gonna lose 5 HP, and my Constitution saving throw is gonna go down by 1. I'm not sure if that's worth it for a +2 sword. He deals in those kind of things. That's the sort of bargains he makes. He doesn't take gold. There's a whole RPG about taking part of a dungeon and making your town kingdom in it. Make you kingdom Japanese only, as far as I know, but there are fan translations. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard of that one before. That's interesting. Taking part of a dungeon and making your own town within it in sort of a dungeon. Very sort of classic Tower of Druaga dungeon meshy kind of thing, where it's a big mega dungeon. Yeah, so it makes sense to kind of like carve out your own sort of little fiefdom in it. That's super cool. That's a very fun, very specific type of game, but a very fun kind of game that I would definitely be into playing. I'm not sure the people my group would be interested in playing it, but I'd be interested in playing it. So completing dungeon chambers and stocking. At the end of this room, dungeon creation process, you should have a few separate lists: room purpose, one room DCs, room dimensions, room contents, dungeon dressing. In the next session, we will take our point mapping in the dungeon, take all our stuff, and start to. We're gonna weave it all together finally. We're putting it all together, baby. With all the dungeon chamber information collected into lists, it's time to begin mapping the dungeon. First, create a node map or flowchart of the dungeon and how all the chambers connect. This is easiest to accomplish using pen and paper. Yeah, that's usually how I do it. I actually, as my players will attest to, I don't make a lot of sort of gridded out maps anymore. I just don't find them that useful most of the time. I I got really, really comfortable playing Theater of the Mind with 5th edition. Uh, com Coming from before that, very, very heavy gridded influence on battle maps, but then having the freeform narrative and be like, oh, I actually don't need gridded maps very often. And it's kind of useless for me to spend a bunch of time mapping out a dungeon that way when I could just connect it with little, like a mind map, circles and lines drawn to each other. Especially if it's like rooms or passages where nothing interesting happens, which is most passages in dungeons. I don't really need to like grid that out. I just need to know where the line goes. So I use that. But that is what I call the kind of step one here. We'll come back, and once you have things finalized, you can come back and do the grid map if you want. Just make things easier. Like I said, there are other ways you can do this. If you want to go grab something like a Dyson Logos map first, and then start filling out that map with stuff using things like this, like tables like these. You can also do that. It's totally flip flops the way you make the dungeon, but it's no better or worse than making it this way. It's really whatever works best for you. If you struggle coming up with dungeon layouts, then yeah, go grab a map and then just start filling it out. If you want a very rational layout, which is often how I do it, uh, want a very sort of rational layout for a dungeon, things in the dungeon make sense, then I think of all the stuff in the dungeon before, and then I figure out what the layout is once I know everything that's got to be in there. So, you create a circle and mark it as the primary entrance of the dungeon. You can use the 1d4 entrances roll table below to determine what part of the dungeon opens up to the outside world. So, in the 5e, we saw that there was like 10 different ways of getting into a dungeon, 10 different dungeon entrances, something like that. In this one, I just dropped it back down to 4. It's either a chamber or corridor, a door, or an elevation change. That's how you get into the dungeon. And it's just going to depend on your placement. So a lot of times it could be an elevation change, so it could be a dry well. That's very common in something like Baldur's Gate 3. Bunch of dry wells. Pretty much every well you run across is dry and leads to a dungeon. Or you just be a door somewhere. It could be a cellar door in a room. It could be a chamber. Maybe it's just a ruined chamber, antechamber of some ruins that you walk into. Or it could be a corridor. It's just a hallway. That makes me think something like Mines of Moria, which technically does have a door in front of it, but I mean, come on. When your safety tool mechanism for keeping people out is them not figuring out to say friend in Dwarvish, not exactly what I call secure. So really, it just kind of opens into a corridor, which they kind of walk into and travel down into the Mines of Moria. After setting up the primary entrance, review your list of room purposes, how best to connect them, and the maps. The arrangement seems thoughtful. Don't be afraid to. I spelled that wrong. Typo there. Don't be afraid to scratch out part of your map or completely start over. This sketch is just a rough idea of the dungeon's layout, and it doesn't need to be pretty. And if I could grab my bag and show you what my current map looks like. I just showed it to the players because they really only have one chamber left. They haven't explored yet, just so they could understand where they had gone wrong on the loop of the dungeon mapping. But yeah, super easy. If you've ever put together a mind map or you use any mind map software, it all works the same like that. You make a little bubble, have some lines coming off of it, maybe a T intersection, things like that. Makes it super simple to look at and parse. Below are some helpful tips to create better dungeon node and graph maps. So 10 tips. These are take them or leave them. I find them useful. Don't always use them. They're not ironclad by any means. They're just kind of like helpful kind of steps along the way. So 10 steps. Number 1, large chambers are public rooms with high foot traffic that should be closer to the center of your layout, often with multiple exits. So you kind of center around your larger chambers, and then around the periphery, you put your smaller chambers, which is number 2. Small chambers are private rooms with low foot traffic, usually situated on the periphery of the layout and attached to public rooms or corridors as side chambers. This just kind of gives you a rational layout. Like if creators made this complex, this is kind of how at least we as humans put together complexes. Now you throw that all out the window if you're like, this is like a Fade created dungeon and nothing makes sense, and you don't need to follow this because these are kind of like humanoid rational kind of things. Number 3, create zones or levels by grouping similar types of chambers together. Each zone should have a maximum of 12 chambers and 0 to 1 boss monsters in it. So yeah, we know that. We've already talked about that. Number 4, add vertical levels to your dungeon with connections, occasionally skipping levels or splitting levels to make a full level inaccessible without performing an elevation change. This is very, very simple, standard, old school dungeons, like how to make cool dungeons. Put loops in them that are both horizontal loops and vertical loops, and make things that sometimes there's no one true way to the dungeon. There's a whole bunch of different ways to pass you can go through it. It makes it more interesting. Be non-linear, create circular paths and alternate routes through the dungeon, create multiple exits to your dungeon for players and monsters to enter or escape from, place a single non-double doors along the sides of chamber walls, not dead center. That's one that comes up a lot, and that's just not how architecture works in the most things, because it's about foot traffic pathing. That's not important. That's not stuff you need to know. all you need to know is like, hey, if you have a small room, don't put the door pretty much in the middle of it. It needs to be offset. Ceilings should not extend more than 20 feet in any direction without support. That's like a wall or a pillar. I like to make pillars smaller than 5 foot so they don't take up a 5 foot square on the grid map. They actually sit at the intersection of 4 squares instead. So they provide a little bit of cover, but they're actually easy to maneuver around. And which gives you a little bit more, makes tactics a little bit easier, and without taking away uh, floor space, square footage of your chamber. Artificial dungeons should be compact, shorten long, winding hallways, and reduce negative space between chambers to squish your dungeon. Notice I said artificial dungeons, so if you're playing in a natural cavern system, you don't need to pay attention to that. Natural caves are weird. They can go on long tangents, they get big, they get small, they do weird curves and then end in chambers. But if you're making an artificial dungeon, like one that is planned and constructed by humans or humanoids or thoughtful sentient creatures in a mindful manner, you're not going to have a ton of long winding corridors that go off to nowhere. That shows up a lot in random dungeon generation, but it's something that I try to cut out very easily. Like, hey, if this thing's not going anywhere, we're just going to cut it off and not make it. We're going to try to squeeze everything into a smaller area than possible, than otherwise would naturally occur. So it feels a little bit more thoughtfully constructed, essentially, is what we're looking for. Moria needed a 20 symbol code with numbers, special symbols, and at least one capital letter. That's right. Yeah. and two-factor authorization. Make sure that you have your sending stone with you so you can parrot back the code to them. Those rules follow the current wizard tower building I'm working on. Nice. All right, so we are aligned in thought. Yes, very similar. So yeah, if you're making something that is made by a sentient creature who's presumably logical, they're going to follow these sort of things. There was an old series back in the old days from called like Architect DM or something. Anyways, it was somebody who was either an architect or architect adjacent who knew a lot about constructions. Uh, Absolutely, kind of putting that together and being like, okay, if you want your dungeons to feel like they're more architectural, here are things to add into it, and adding things like buttresses and pillars. And pillars don't have to be huge; they can be really small as long as they're towards the middle of the room. And how positioning that in the room makes the room more interesting to go around and gives you different pathways, so it's not always you can run in a straight line from any point to another point in a room, which makes things a little bit more tactically fulfilling. You have to a little bit more thinky, which is nice in combat, which is sometimes, especially for your fighters who are also usually like, I run up to the guy and I hit him with my sword until he stops moving, and then I hit him once more for good measure. Yeah, the two-factor authorization at the Mines of Moria. Uh, that's silly, but it does make me want to put it in some sort of dungeon at some point and be like, oh, do you have the 2FA on? Did you put in the code? You can learn a lot by looking at the evolution of dungeons from the 70s now. Yeah, yeah, they look very different. Yeah, definitely in the 70s it was all this sort of sprawling labyrinthine. Like the idea was that the player, as a DM, that very sort of DM versus player kind of mindset, where the part of just getting around the dungeon, like being able to map the dungeon and get around it, is a significant portion of the challenge, and they do that with a lot of weird things like, oh, the dungeon level actually goes down. There's actually a decline in this passage, but it's so subtle that most characters other than dwarves won't recognize that it's going down. So that way it screws up all your mapping after a while. Yeah, we don't really do that style of play for the most part anymore, but I do think the mapping has its place. Player mapping has its place. I usually don't give my players the full dungeon map, but I do help them along the way. I'm not trying to intentionally get them lost in a dungeon because I don't think that being lost in a dungeon is particularly fun for anybody. Just not knowing where to go and just kind of being paralyzed by the analysis is not fun. And I think it's a little mean spirited play. So I don't enjoy that particularly, but I'm sure some people do. And you're old school, so it'll appear when I run monsters. Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I think I'm the same way. As I try to pull some of the good stuff, some of the ooey gooey goodness out of some of the OSR kind of ideas and pull it into a more modern system. Just because it's easier to find people who want to play D&D most of the time than it is to find people who want to play OSR stuff. And not that's not assuming, not trying to infer that modern systems don't have anything good in them. They have plenty of good design in them and things that I prefer a lot more over old school stuff. So let's assign our dungeon chamber list. Once you are happy with the flowchart of your dungeon, it's time to assign the remainder of dungeon chamber list items to the rooms on your map. Use the 10 tips from Better Dungeon Layout for assistance. So it gets to the point where you're starting to figure out, okay, this is what the grid map would kind of look like a little bit. Got your dungeon chamber dimensions. Apply room dimensions to the room of your existing map by considering 2 points of criteria. First, the function of the room. It will seem strange if your dungeon has a 10 by 10 great hall, but an 80 by 60 kitchen. So, flop them. And this is why we kind of do the list setup, so you can make things feel a little bit more logical. And then you kind of draw a line between the different lists of how things connect. Second, consider the location. Large chambers are easier to connect with branching paths, can handle more traffic, which makes them ideal for positioning towards the center of your dungeon layout. Just like in the previous example, it would seem weird if an 80 by 60 kitchen was the dominating chamber of your entire dungeon, but as an 80 by 60 great hall, that makes a lot more sense for why it's in the middle of the dungeon. It is like the primary central chamber of the whole thing. In a very sort of almost Zelda dungeon design where you walk in and you're like, oh, there's the boss room. I can't go. Either can't or don't want to go into it right now. I'm going to sneak around the periphery a little bit and see what I can find in here. Maybe level up a little bit. Maybe get some loot. Maybe avoid the big monster that's in here completely, depending on what our goal is for going in here. If our goal is just to get rich, and I'm not trying to get in a fight with a squid giant, I just want loot. Assigning your DCs. When placing the room DCs on your dungeon flowchart, seek a balance in the challenges. Avoid a dungeon where one area, like one side of the map, has all the difficult stuff, and then the other side has all the easy stuff. Try to make sure that those get mixed up a little bit. Avoid letting a high DC turn a challenge into a bottleneck dead end. Similar to a puzzle, a locked door with a high DC can stop the party's dungeon crawling in its tracks. That's why it's important to put the loops in there. If you've got your rogue who can't make the DC check on their thieves tools, and your only other option is breaking down the door, but you're afraid of breaking down the door is going to draw a lot of attention. You're like, what do we do? And so having a way for them to get around the dungeon without having to deal with this particular challenge right then and have to do it is really, really helpful. Mix up the different types of room content and challenges the parties will face to avoid most creature encounters happening in one part of the dungeon, exploration challenges happening in a different area. Yeah, just making sure that you have a kind of peppered balance of stuff throughout there. Also consider the dimensions of the chamber when placing creature encounters. Placing a single goblin in a huge chamber isn't usually the best use of space. Without care, you can end up with a situation where 10 goblins are located in a 3x3 room, and you're like, how are there 10 creatures in a 9 square room? Yeah, that is difficult. I did not think about that. They're just squeezed in here for some reason. This is our goblin closet. This is where we keep our goblins. Yeah, you just toss them in there. Yeah, there's no real organization. They just kind of have to push the door closed. Goblins trying to burst out, little green arms sticking out and stuff, trying to get out. Get in there, you stupid goblins. So, anyways, we put the goblins in the goblin closet. Let's go on to the next bit of our tour. So doing that, dungeon dressing, the presenting dungeon dressing entries are generic to fit most dungeons with relative ease. As noted, the biggest challenge with dungeon dressing is fielding player questions about it. Because sometimes they'll just hone in on it. It's like, it's not that important. It's just kind of like a context thing. Placing dungeon dressing where it makes most sense to you will make it easier to explain to players when they ask about that stuff. So it's like, I knew that I was going to have a campsite in my current dungeon. I was like, where would that make the most sense? Well, I know the opening room has a real nasty trap in it. So it's unlikely that the campsite's in there because the trap is still active. So maybe it makes more sense if I put it next to the secondary entrance, which would be the ruined armory. And it's like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. That's a good place for it. But they also could have put it in a few other chambers that would have also made sense. And there were also chambers that it would not have made sense. Would have made sense in the sentry station with the clay soldiers because they don't let anybody in that room. They're automatons, and they have a mission. And if you try to get in that room and you're not supposed to be in that room, they're going to try and kill you. So would not make sense for there to be a campsite in there if those guys were still around. Balcony and gallery dungeon dressing are simple ways to make combat more interesting and create nonlinear traversal between different areas and levels of your dungeon. Place these first to ensure they facilitate where different areas of the dungeon can meet. So one of the things that can come up in dungeon dressing is a balcony or a gallery, and that just determines on whether this sort of mezzanine area is accessed from within the room or from a different area. So a gallery comes from, or a balcony comes from a different area. A gallery comes from the current area. You kind of have a mezzanine walk around halfway up, and that can really add some interest to combat encounters by immediately putting a second level of stuff in the same room. So you can put some archers up top and have some big beefy guys down low, and then your players got to figure out a way to get upstairs to deal with the archers while also trying to get around the big beefy guy who's on the ground. Classic encounter design stuff that we all do and we all love. it's good, all fun, good to me. Old or current, every system edition has pros. Yeah, absolutely. There's stuff that I like about all the different editions, and things I don't like about all the editions too. Yeah, it is odd there's no dungeon design advice in 2024. You really see them kind of moving away from that stuff. Some of the old adventures require serious reworking and thought to present in a way that makes sense to anyone in 1970s or now. Yeah, well, also, there's a lot of 1970s stuff that's just funhouse dungeons. They're like, none of this makes sense. This is all like crazy wizard stuff. And that's okay to have crazy wizard stuff and throw it in the game. It's just, I don't want every dungeon to feel like, crazy wizard stuff. Like it's all gonzo stuff. Like I want most of it to feel pretty grounded in the world. And then, yeah, occasionally there's just a wackadoo wizard off doing weird stuff in their wizard tower. Themes can help to show transition between larger sections of dungeon too. Yeah, the idea is like each area or zone is going to have some sort of thematic element within it, some sort of thing that kind of holds it together. And that could be dungeon dressing, that could be the creature types, that could be whatever that part of the dungeon was constructed for. Like it could be all like a manufacturing area. Maybe that's the mining area. So there's a whole bunch of like mine carts and mine tools, and maybe there's some poison gas, canary style, with some dead. Come across some dead birds that are hanging in cages, and that'll tip them off that hey, there's some deadly poison that's in here they need to watch out for. Or fire that can, like methane that will explode into flame if you use fire spells in there. They can check out. Even though probably not going to smell great in there, so maybe that'll tip you off. But yeah, having themes is super helpful. All right. Finally, it's the dungeon map and fill in details. It's likely that in the process of assigning your list to items to the map that it's now somewhat difficult to parse as it's kind of a working thing. Create a new map or updated flowchart node map or gridded dungeon map. While creating the new map, fill in the gaps of your map with details like doors and corridors and some of the stuff that we haven't talked about yet. We've primarily only talked about chambers, so we got to have places to get in between those chambers. Sometimes it'll make more sense for those chambers to be right next to each other, like the kitchen and larder that we talked about previously, where it makes sense for there only to be a doorway between them instead of a hallway. But it might make more sense for, like I said, have a hallway that's next to like a great hall, but then also has these side private chambers alongside those, maybe like a private suite or a research room or a little library or a study or something like that. So adding those things together. While planning your revised map, consider where corridors best fit into the planned outline. Often it makes sense for similarly themed chambers to connect directly, such as sacristy, which is the small religious storage chamber, and directly abutting a large temple, whereas a corridor would make more sense for communal sleeping and dining areas to be accessed by doors in a shared hallway, rather than directly having a dormitory bedroom go directly into like a mess hall. That would be a little weird, because it's a whole bunch of people trying to get through one doorway, back and forth. For your dungeon doorways, consider the door material and its current status. Is it open? Is it an open doorway, a wooden door, a metal door, etc.? Is the door ajar, broken, locked, barred, stuck, trapped, or simply closed? Broken, barred, or Broken Bard and Stuck don't come up that much. I think in a lot of contemporary D&D, they used to come up a lot in old school stuff, like having the idea that sometimes dungeon door's just stuck, like it's just swelled in the door frame, and you can't unlock it. You have to like figure out a way to bust it down and get through it if you want to get through it. Now it doesn't make a little difference as to where monsters are in your thing. If there are a bunch of monsters behind the stuck door, you're gonna be like, what? But it could be just recently swelled shut, or maybe they're stuck in there. Maybe they're trapped in there. And you can roll tables for doors, corridors, and other dungeon facets can be found in the dungeon miscellaneous section that's upcoming. And then we're going to kind of end with what are the monsters doing? This is a good thing that also doesn't come up very often in Dungeon Generation, I find. I think it came up in the 2014 one, though. One side of a low quality dungeon is one where the monsters do nothing but wait for adventurers to show up. Great dungeons have the monsters in motion. They aren't simply standing around waiting for someone to break into their home. Below is a list of many different things monsters can do in the dungeon. In addition to the listed preoccupations below, don't forget dungeon creators and dungeon inhabitants can make use of the original facilities purposes. So, these are just monsters' preoccupations, stuff that they do. There's one of the things that I put in my actual like Dungeon Master binder. I have the same roll table in it. Whenever I have like a random encounter, they sneak up or they find monsters in the wild. Like say that let's see, not that long ago they recently, or they might come across Chatsman. So they're going to come across some people who are probably camped out, and there might be a reasonable question when they get out of the dungeon. Hey, what are they doing? As we sneak out because we know they're there. So I roll a d10. Maybe I'll roll 2d10. This table don't always put them together, but it might be easy to have like one group doing one thing and one group doing another. So I rolled a 7 and an 8. So one group could be studying, so they could be giving instruction, practicing, sparring, and 8 is talking. They could be having berating somebody, having a discussion or jokes. So yeah, if I'm thinking like a group that's camped out, you might have some people who are doing some practice sparring, like a couple of guys who are off to the side who are doing a little practice sparring, and maybe people are watching them, and the rest of them are kind of sitting around the campfire having a little discussion, maybe telling some jokes, just having a kind of a nice leisurely time. Now I know what the monsters are doing when they show up. When the players show up, and the players can look at and be like, they seem pretty distracted. Maybe we can just sneak around them. Maybe we don't necessarily have to engage them. They seem kind of preoccupied. Maybe we can just sneak around them. And maybe it's like if we talked about them sitting around the fire, maybe a lot of them don't have things like their armor on because we're talking about humanoids in this context. They don't have like their armor on. They're not battle ready. They're making camp essentially, except for the two who are dressed and fully kitted out because they're in the practice. They're doing practice farming, and maybe it's more than two. Maybe there's a few of them. So in case there is an encounter, it's not a super easy encounter because everybody's AC is 10, and they don't have any weapons on them. Yeah, the crazy hermit with 20 cats in the rooms who's living in a dungeon infested with vampires and all sorts of deadly monsters takes some explaining. It does, but it doesn't mean you can't have that crazy guy in there with 20 cats. Maybe you have some sort of a. Maybe you make it something like there's something in between the vampire and the cats. Because D&D vampires are a little weird, and vampire legend in general mythos is a little weird and amorphous and flexible. And if you lean into where you're looking at like black cats and maybe like witchcraft and maybe like they are uh, protectors against evil and things like that because of there's a lot of cat iconography around that symbolism, a lot of things. Be like, oh, they can't get in there because this guy, and that's why this crazy hermit keeps all these cats. He's like, I got to keep the cats. The cats are the only thing to keep me safe from the vampires. So you can do something like that, and it's a very easy way to do it. Yeah, why is that door secured shut? To keep folks out or monsters in. Exactly. It's barred. It's you come across a stuck door, but it's barred from this side, and you hear something very large scuttering around on the other side. Oh, the cats are foreshadowing critters. Yeah, maybe you don't know that the vampires are in there yet. Maybe the cats give you some of that as foreshadowing. Yeah, I can see that. That'd be really cool. That'd be very interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of cool directions you could take that in as far as the cats and the crazy hermit and vampire or vampires, multiple. So yeah, that's monster preoccupations. It's all super easy stuff like arguing. They're doing something with food. They're doing something like handy, some sort of handicraft. They're doing hygiene. They're doing some sort of leisure activity. They're resting. They're studying. They're talking. They're working, or they're worshiping. That's sort of the list that I use. It's very simple and straightforward. It kind of gives you an idea of what everybody's doing. Now, you might run into some weird circumstances where you have monsters who are worshiping, but if you're in your dungeon, there is actually like a temple or a shrine or something, and they're not in that room. You might have a very interesting question. Maybe they worship a different deity or a different creature, or all those sort of like context clues that give you the ability to like do a little show don't tell kind of explanation as the characters sort of sneak up on them, and you have the rogue that sneaks up and be like, I don't know, they seem to be in prayer about something, but why aren't they in the temple? And come back and maybe talk with the cleric that's in the party, and the cleric can give them some insight. It's like, oh, you saw this symbol. Well, that symbol must be for the demon lord of Orcus or whoever it is. And be like, oh, they're doing that. So obviously they can't do that in the consecrated temple. So they're doing it out here. He's being protected by Bast. Crazy priest, really. Yeah, you can also lean into it that aspect. Yeah, for your crazy hermit. And creating dungeon chamber descriptions. While you may have a clear picture in your head of what a dungeon chamber looks like, I usually do, my ability to get that to my players is sometimes suspect. Sometimes it makes me feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. It's like I don't understand how you guys don't see the same thing I see in my head. Gosh, just understand my vision. But as a DM, you likely need to be able to convey that important information accurately to your players. So here's an easy description formula that you can use to prep your dungeons. You can write the chamber descriptions as fully developed, like read aloud text boxes, or it's just bullet points that you can improvise when you come across them. It's just kind of a 5-step process. Very simple, very straightforward. Number 1, what is the room's general purpose, feel, and size? Number 2, point out the obvious exits to the chamber and a sensory detail to help build the atmosphere. So some sort of taste or smell or something they hear. A feel, as in like a temperature difference, uh, anything like that. Maybe they see something specific. Maybe there's like some shimmering in the air, etc. If there's magic in the room. Number 3, note the room's dungeon dressing. If you haven't done that already with point 2. And number 4, end by pointing to the room's prime point of interest or actionable challenge. So you want to end on the thing that's the actionable thing, because sometimes if you do this backwards, and you're like, oh well, I described that there is the squid giant in this room. The moment you say squid giant, that's all the players are going to focus on. And they're not going to hear any of the other stuff. They're going to be thinking squid giant and immediately start looking at their abilities and skill lists and spells and stuff like that and trying to figure out what that is. And they're not going to be paying attention to anything else that's going on in the chamber. So you kind of want to end on that focal point of what the big bang moment is. Kind of an outward end. You're kind of like bullseyeing yourself to the primary important thing. So you end that. And then you end that, and then you give them the prompt for what do you want to do? You prompt the players to act. So here's an example of chamber description using the framework. Ruined Armory, DC 11. You enter a musty 40 by 30 ruined armory. General description. You guys know what an armory looks like. There's racks of weapons and armor on it. I don't really need to go into a ton of detail. You know it's ruined, so you know the stuff in here is probably not usable. Broken spears and other remnants of arms and armor litter the floor amongst fragmented stone. In the passage behind you, you can hear the sound of the complex settling, widening echoes as it shifts. The center of the ruined armory is blocked by rubble from the half-collapsed ceiling. Searching the rubble, you feel the tiniest of moving air flow, and with light you can peer through a crack in the rubble to spot a reinforced wooden door beyond the barrier of collapsed ceiling. The door appears barred from this side. What do you do? This gives them the idea, it's like, oh, well, there's another doorway, so if we walk around this chamber in the hallway of the dungeons, well, we can probably find the other doorway to see what's on the other side, and there might be some treasure on that side. They'd be like, oh, but it's still barred from the side. But you might be like, oh, but I have Mage Hand, and I have line of sight to it, so can I cast Mage Hand and lift the bar off the door? And I might go, yeah, that seems reasonable. Or, if we have 2 people in the party who have Mage Hand, I might be like, oh, the bar's heavy, so it's going to require both of you to do it, so you guys both have to coordinate together. Both have to, like, stick your heads together so you can peer through this little hole in the rubble. as you do your magic, trying to, in both of your mage hands, kind of come up and grab the bar and whoop, flip it off the doorway, and then you guys are able to walk around and get into it. So that way you don't have to like make a whole bunch of noise breaking down the door. Or you might have a druid in your party who's like, yeah, I turned into like a mouse or something, and I scrabble through the rubble and get to the other side, and I just open up the door from that side. Or I can at least go in that room and tell you if anything's in there. Now, if they get in that room and there's a big nasty monster in there they haven't come across yet, that could be an issue if you have a hidden monster in that room. This room, the way that I originally created, this was a real room that I really ran. Did not have a monster in it. The only thing that was in here, the obstacle in here, was the collapsed ceiling. There was nothing else in here. I think there might have been some treasure in here, actually. I can't remember. There was either a treasure or a dead body in here that gave them some context as to what was going on there. One of those two things. I don't remember which now. It's been some years since I ran this. Excellent advice on descriptive aspects of the room. Yes, order descriptive and part. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I try. The ability of players to hyper-focus on unimportant details always amazes me. Yeah, that's why I'm like, you have to be really careful with the dungeon dressing. Because they'll totally, like I said, even in this one, if I had it in the passage behind you hear the sound of whining echoes, my players would absolutely hyper-focus on that and be like, oh no, there must be monsters coming up behind me. I'm like, no, I'm going to make it clear. It is the complex settling. This is just weird sounds that old buildings make. That's all that's happening. It's just this atmospheric echoing, but reinforce how quiet otherwise things are. So if you want to go break down that door, you're going to make a bunch of noise, and it's going to echo through a lot of hallways. So somebody's probably going to hear it if you do that. So maybe you want to look for that mage hand or some other way to open the door on the other side. Or maybe your rogue can come up with some shenanigans to try to get it out. Maybe they do the old, I'm going to hook a string around the bar and pull it through and lift it that way, something like that. So there's lots of ways for them to sort of get around the challenge without having to break down the door and hopefully, and unfortunately, bringing all the denizens of the dungeon down upon them in this otherwise quiet room. Or maybe you're smart and you have a wizard with you or some other spellcaster, and they're like, yeah, I just cast silence and we break this door down. Perfect use of the silence spell. Yeah, you can absolutely cast silence and then hack this door to bits with nobody the wiser. Now you might want to put somebody on perception checks to watch your backs because you're in this sphere of silence, so you're not going to hear anybody walking up on you, and monsters might just walk up on you and stab you in the back if you're not paying attention, because you're not going to have the perception of being able to hear them walking up behind you. So we finish this off with some wandering monsters. At this point, you should have a complete or near complete dungeon that is ready to run. It's encouraged you to create a list of wandering monsters encounters to use in conjunction with your new dungeon. So then we have a little paragraph about wandering monsters for those who random encounters. Wandering monsters kind of fallen out of vogue. Other people are like, oh well, it's a waste of time. It's not important to the story, etc., etc. And so I did want to do something that I don't think a lot of newer editions do a good job of telling you why they're kind of an essential part of the play scheme. So I wanted to throw this in here for people who have always kind of poo-pooed wandering monsters for random encounters. And it's usually like an experience or education kind of issue, like they don't really understand the why you might want to put them in the adventure. So we're just going to tell you real quick. Many modern dungeon masters and groups are quick to turn their noses up at wandering monsters. However, wandering monsters have a specific purpose in adventures. Used correctly, wandering monsters pressure the adventuring party from tarrying at the risk of wasting precious resources on throwaway combat encounters. It is a powerful tool to keep players from stalling out in adventures. Roll a 1d6 to check for wandering monster encounters. On a wandering monster encounter threatens the party. Try putting fate in your players' hands by having them occasionally roll the wandering monster check. I do this for my players a lot. I make them roll the dice for me. I have had them crit on themselves. I have had them crit fail on themselves. I often have them roll for their own wandering monster checks, or if a trap's going to go off, or if the perception check sees them stealthing by. I like to put it in their hands sometimes, just for fun. So that way I'm not always the bad guy. The bad guys are the bad guys. I just interpret what's happening. It's the DM. So below are some instances when you should check for wandering monsters. 1. The players get distracted or off topic at the table. hey, if you guys are just standing around in this dungeon corridor having a conversation, there's a chance a monster's gonna walk up on you. Like they're wandering around throughout the complex all the time. They're moving around. The party stops forward motion or progression to the dungeon to make a search or begins backtracking in the dungeon. That's when you're like, this isn't just a super safe place to be wandering around. Number three, the players can't decide on the course of action. If they get stuck, like we talked about them getting stuck, 3 and 4 is very similar. If they're arguing about they're at the T intersection, they're arguing about which way to go. Chance of wandering monster is going to hear you and come see what's going on. Number 4, the players get stuck on a non-combat challenge or puzzle. We talked about that challenge for. If they get stuck and they can't seem to get past it, be like, oh, well, I'm going to throw a potential wandering monster at you, and even often the threat of it is enough. And this idea that, oh, there are stuff here, we can't just sit here and not do anything. So maybe if I built loops into them, they're like, let's go check out that other passageway we haven't gone down yet. And then we can come back on this, and maybe we'll find some clue or something that will help us get through this, or maybe we don't need to get through it at all. And do it that way. And number 5, the party attempts to rest in or around the dungeon, rolling multiple times, such as per watch, when resting can be judiciously employed. Like, hey, if you're just going to try to do a Goldilocks and hop in some bugbear's bed and try to sleep, get your winks in, get 8 hours of perfect rest. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty likely that somebody's going to come across you. There's a high chance of that. Even if you barricade yourselves in a room, they're going to be like, why is this door closed? Hey, why is this door closed? And then they're going to try to break it down. Especially if you've left a wake of bodies, a bunch of blood behind you. I mean, they're going to know somebody's in here. So you got to be really careful. Now, down here at the end, I put a little extra advice. Be gentle. Often the threat of wandering monster encounter is enough prod to get your players back on track and making forward progress. It can be as easy as the mere notice of you rolling the dice for them to be like, we should move on. Or informing the party that the sounds of nearby creatures is growing louder. That you hear somebody footsteps down the hallway. And sometimes they'll be like, all right, we gotta leave. We don't want to fight these guys, whoever they are, or risk them being discovered in the dungeon. So we're going to move on. So, yeah, guard patrols, exactly. Wandering monsters exist because the dungeon is a living place. They're always moving around. Monsters involved in hunting, maintenance, trade, monsters looking for a new home. They're lost. They are 100% a resource to move the game along and stress player resources. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just often surprised how rarely that's expressed in something like a Dungeon Master's Guide to teach you, like, random encounters aren't just random. Like, they're a tool that you use in your DM toolbox to use for things. They can both be helpful or a hindrance, foreshadowing. They show the players a trap, food and water resources. There's also sometimes you can put wandering monster table. They don't all have to be combat-oriented monsters. Like we said, there can be NPCs, traders, the rival adventuring party that's in there that you guys can come across, and you guys can share information or have a social RP scene. And while you guys do that, if you guys now there's instead of 4 people standing in the hallway, now there's 8 people standing in the hallway. Now I'm going to roll a random wandering monster check with disadvantage. So I'm going to roll 2d6 and take the lower. And if I roll a 1, guess what? Other people start to show up. And then, all 8 of you are going to scatter around because you guys don't want to be here when the monsters show up. Yeah, show the players a trap kind of style. Yeah. Food and water sources. The dungeon OSHA and Inspector Goblin are mighty. Yeah. Like in the current dungeon I'm running, they're actually encountering the boss monster of the dungeon in a hallway. They did not quite make it to the room. He got wind of them. The monster came to investigate and has found the party, and now they've got to fight this boss monster in a hallway. And he's got a whole bunch of movement stuff. He's a very agile monster. So he's going to be hopping around them and doing all sorts of stuff while they're just sort of stuck together in this hallway. So it'll be interesting. So, create a wandering monster table. 6 wandering monster entries is usually adequate for most play sessions. Use the 1d6 normal monsters table to determine the difficulty of your wandering monster encounters. Because again, they should be relatively easy or trivial encounters. The whole point is that there are attacks on resources, so you're not expecting to get a lot of treasure or XP out of them. They're kind of something that just cuts into you, death by 1,000 cuts style. You don't want to get into these encounters because you don't get anything out of them. They are more of a punishment than they are a boon. Develop the creature encounters using your dungeon factions with respect to the level or zones of the dungeon the party is currently delving. So you might want different 1d6 wandering monster charts for different zones of a dungeon if you're making a larger dungeon. Which would include primarily monsters that are in the zone already, but you might want a couple of entries from some of the nearby zones. Like somebody has come from the Dwarven Mine spot into this underground cavern, so there might be some dwarves you run across, but most of the time it's going to be Underdark stuff. And occasionally you might come across a dwarf. And so same thing, just kind of mix it up a little bit. As you use the encounters on your Wandering Monster table, cross entries out. That way you can replace them with new encounters between dungeon crawl sessions and keep it fresh. Like I said, the way that I usually try to zero in, I like a nice 2 to 3 session dungeon. So the chances is they're going to come across probably, depending on how slow they are, probably at least 2 Wandering Monster rolls during that time that I'll use. I'll use those encounters, so that gives me a nice, easy, like, one in-between session prep. Be like, I need another some more trivial monsters to put on this, and I'll just swap them out. And that's most of my between session prep done for a dungeon, which is very nice. It's like 5 minutes of figuring out, what do I want to put as a replacement here. Then we're getting down to the nitty gritty and wrapping up the dungeon creation. You seriously think the dungeon delving should be treated as survival game, resource management, and locating new resources important? Yeah. I think that is the game aspect that oftentimes, especially now, gets overlooked a lot on the D&D side. When we think about D&D, is that D&D, when you look at it, when you sit down and you look at a character sheet, and what characters get as they level up, you realize that it is just a resource management game. Hit points, resource. Spell slots, resource. Abilities, resource. Tools, resource. Rations, resource. Torches, resource. Like all these sort of finite resources that you're using. And so for the game to really, the engine of the game to work the way that it's meant to do, is that you need to continually tax those resources. That's how you avoid those things where we talk about. Oftentimes when I hear dungeon masters talk about, especially newer dungeon masters talk about how they can't challenge their party in combats, and it's like, well, how many combats are you giving them in a day? Are you allowing them to like go Nova? Like they've had a long rest in between every single encounter. That makes every single encounter a big encounter, number one. And so combat always seems like it takes a whole bunch of time. Instead of trying to be like, let's actually make combats really, really small and really, really quick. Like instead of having, a bunch of big room combats, let's have a bunch of like 1d6 plus 1 goblins attack. And it's like, hey, every time that you're not moving through the dungeon, there's a chance that, another 4 goblins are coming down the hallway. And you're going to have to fight those guys. And sure, yeah, they're not a huge challenge, but, they're probably going to get some shots in. You might have to use a first level spell on them. And before you know, you're going to be out of first level spells. And you're going to be running out of healing surges if you're taking, healing surges. Hit dice if you're using short rests. So, you really start to sort of churn through their resources in a day. And then they're in the middle of the dungeon, and they're like, I need to take a long rest. But I know if I try to take a long rest in this dungeon, that is an extremely bad idea. Think of how often we've run across monsters already just trying to take short rests or wander around in the dungeon. If we try to bed down for 8 hours, we're going to get attacked by so many monsters, we're not going to get a rest. So, really puts that pressure and that stress on them to be like, you got to get through the dungeon and go. And so sometimes you can't do a deep search on every single chamber you go in. Sometimes we're like, we have a quick look around. If we don't see anything, and we're not getting the spider senses of tingling that's like, hey, maybe there's a secret room or cubby or something in here, we just move on. We don't have time to search every single inch of this. We can't look for traps in every single 5-foot square of the hallway. We just gotta go. We can't always do that. Because the more time that we spend in here and the slower we go, the more combats we're going to get into with monsters. And that's going to always end up poorer for us than better. So it's a balancing act in that idea. So wrapping up the dungeon creation. If you followed the steps so far, you should have in your hands a completed dungeon, ready to run for your next game session. Congratulations! Hopefully the process has shown how a dungeon creation process with random and non-random elements can create a fantastic dungeon that's as much fun for your players as it is to run as a dungeon master. But that's not all. For those who want truly random dungeon generation, because we're all sickos, we all are masochists who want some of that, combine this process in the above roll tables with the additional roll tables included in the dungeon miscellany section below. Be warned, true random dungeons are often nonsensical, as we talked about, in a way that can break suspension of disbelief. That said, a totally random dungeon can be quite entertaining as a form of play known as a funhouse dungeon. These dungeons are created by mad mages and supernatural entities as a form of cruel entertainment, adventure, or blood sport. If that is something you want to add to your game, go ahead and try out a fully random generation using the tables in the next section. It's almost like an AI constructed dungeon, where you're like, it's got all the pieces of what should make sense, but all the order is all weird and nonsensical. It's like somebody's aping what a sapient logical being would organize rooms and things, and they haven't done that, so it's weird. It's a little unsettling and off-putting. Oh, fatigue rules, people use them. Yeah, there are many ways to do it, but yeah, I use exhaustion rules all the time. Exhaustion is real tough. I use my exhaustion primarily for overland challenges, though it is included in this trap section here as one of the things that there are a lot of different traps and tricks that do things like, oh, this thing, rather than does hit point damage, deals, it gives you exhaustion, or it gives you a condition, or it eats your spell slots, or eats your gold. Sometimes there's traps that just eat your gold pieces. Does that and takes your money and loot and treasure, all sorts of nasty things that are in dungeons, or just spells going weird and wrong that just could maybe they just crumple magic as a fuel source for this wild spell magic that's going on. Yeah, but exhaustion is real bad. I prefer the 2014 rules for exhaustion. Those are the ones that I use. I don't like the 2024 rules because they went back to just having little floating modifiers that change rather than having more condition style changes. So I don't like them -1, -2, -3, -4 to all sorts of different rolls that I then have to do additional math to. So I mean, like, no, you're slowed. You have disadvantage on checks. No, you have disadvantage on attacks and saves. No, your speed is 0. I feel like that's a lot more, has a nicer escalation factor to it than just a -1, -2, -3, -4 kind of style. So, Dungeon Miscellany. The section that contains additional roll tables and information to help you bring your dungeon to life. It also includes instructions on how to use the tables together to create a truly random dungeon. So, chamber exits, and there's a 25% chance, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, yep. 25% chance that there are no more exits in the chamber when you're rolling for chamber exits. But there could be a secret door, so you need to check for secret doors. Left wall from the entrance, opposite wall from the entrance, right wall, same wall as the entrance. Elevation change. On the elevation change, roll again. On a 10, the elevation change causes the chamber to become multi-leveled. So there's multiple levels within the room. Which might be like an open like courtyard or foyer with or atrium with a secondary sort of like mezzanine level on it, or maybe multiple levels on it, or maybe like a fire escape kind of situation that goes up to maybe like 2 dungeon floors above. On your secret doors, most of the time, not going to have a secret door, surprisingly. Then it's going to be left wall, right wall, opposite wall, floor, or ceiling. And then you check all the beyond door tables. The dungeon doors, 1d8 doors. 1 through 2, open doorway. Another thing that shows up in a lot of the dungeon creation is just open doorways, or number 3, curtains or privacy screens. Like there's just something that obscures vision. Not difficult to get through, but does obscure your vision as to what's beyond the door. So that's a fun way to put monsters behind the door without making it be like, oh, you have to break down the door or have to, open the door. It's like, no, you can just walk in, but you don't really have a good visual as to what's in the room until you get into it. A wood or reinforced door, a metal or stone door, a gate or portcullis often doesn't come up very often. Portcullises come up sometimes, but gates very rarely come up. So I'm going to add gates back in. And then number 8 is a magic or puzzle door. I know I said there weren't puzzles in here, but yeah, there's a spot where you can throw a puzzle door in there. or just saying magical door. So it might be magically locked, it might be hidden magically. Magic is a very amorphous term, and maybe it's a portal that you go through that takes you to a different thing. Maybe it's a doorway that was clearly this used to be a wall until somebody did like stone shape on it and basically punched an entranceway into this wall. And then that tells you that, oh, other people have been here before. The door status, is it ajar or broken? Is it closed? Is it locked? 10% chance it's magic locked. Is it barred? Is it stuck? Does it have some sort of trigger trap? So one of the things that I did find as we were going through in the previous stream, talking about random dungeon generation, all the tricks and traps on doors were always on fake doors, which I thought was very interesting because I feel like I almost never see that in any sort of module, any sort of actually published adventure. There are plenty of trap doors, but there are very few that the doors the it's a trap in and of itself and it's not actually a door. So I did put this in here because I wanted to add in that aspect to kind of pull that back in and use that in a way that I hadn't been using it before. Be like, okay, when you roll a trigger trap on a 6 for a door status, reroll, and then on a 6 again, the door is not real. So whatever was behind that door, and that ain't real. Uh, and then that makes sense why you have passages that wander off into a dead end, essentially, because there's a fake door at the end of it that's a trap. But of course, if you know it's a trap, you wouldn't go down there and try the door. If you know the door's not real, it doesn't go anywhere. This is very clear. So, beyond the chamber, or beyond the door, there's a chamber, straight passage, you go to corridors, passage to the left or right, passage to the left and right. So you come in at sort of like the bottom part of a T intersection. Walled off or collapsed with rubble, roll again. And a trick or trap, roll again for beyond the door. So a lot of these are just kind of just tables that we're just kind of run through. They're just things that help you sort of like flesh out the dungeon a little bit more, especially when it comes to like the corridors and stuff that's in between rooms. One of the things that I sometimes do in corridors is I'll take we have that 2d6 roll chart for table contents for chamber contents, and I'll roll just a 1d6 on a hallway just to see it's like, hey, is there anything in this hallway? And there's a 1 in 3 chance that there's not anything in it. There's a 1 in 3 chance that there's maybe a trap in it. It's a trapped hallway. And a 1 in 3 chance that there is a wandering monster check in that hallway. So I just remind myself, hey, whenever they pass this area, I'm just going to roll for a random monster, even if they're not tarrying. So that way, even when the group's being super efficient about going through the dungeon, they're staying on path, they're doing, they've gone full on like SEAL Team 6, and they are just, we are finding and securing the objective, and we are getting out, and then we're going to get out, and we're playing at that style of game. We're playing our fantasy Vietnam style game, which old style games can be a lot like that. It'd be like we get in there, we get the things, we get out, and we don't tarry around here very long, and we don't want to get in fights. We want to get in as few fights as possible. Wandering monster check for me is in like, okay, there's always a chance that somebody could just be coming down the hallway, and it has nothing to do with you guys hanging out for too long or making too much noise or anything like that. So doing that. And so in the corridors, straight, the door, there's a dead end. And on the dead end, we have some roll tables there's junk or trash pile, stacked containers, a cupboard, a sitting area, a shrine or statue, some sort of alcove with a brazier in it, something. It could be an intersection, a chamber, a trick or trap, roll again, wandering monster, roll again, elevation change. So we can put our wandering monsters in there if we want to. So yeah, using this instead. Intersection, corridor turns right, corridor turns left, trying to make sure that we keep those 90-degree turns in there that are not present in some of the earlier ones. There's straight door, or go straight with a door on the left, straight with a door on the right, dead ends with a door to the left and right, which gives you potentially 2 chambers. A 4-way intersection, which means left, right, straight. Elevation change, shaft or chimney, straight stairs, straight ramp, spiral ramp. Some sort of ladder or a rope, an elevator or a trapdoor, or some sort of like, wizard BS, some sort of magic. There's like a flying platform, a teleport, something that takes you from one area to another with some wizard stuff, weird stuff that's in there. and a D6 for your level change. 1 through 3, it's up or down 1 level. 4 through 5, it's up or down, up 1 level and down 1 level, so you're in the middle section. It goes up and down. And on a 6, it goes up or down 2 levels. I usually try to do, I don't make a lot of level dungeons in general, just vertically, because I don't want to spend that much time in a dungeon. I feel like most of the groups I play with have a pretty low tolerance for dungeons, so I don't really want to spend a ton of time in there. And having multiple levels basically doubles the size of the dungeon that I usually want to make right off the bat. Unless I'm, not always, but sometimes it does. But I've also done dungeons that have had like 4 or 5 levels, and there's only a handful of rooms on each level that they kind of go through. And that's also another way to do it. I like a good 3-level structure if I'm going to do multiple levels. So a top level, a middle level, and a bottom level. Usually with the middle level kind of being the usual level, and then top level being a place where maybe that's hidden or special place to get into, and bottom level being like a basement or an underdark natural cavern situation, something like that. Pretty common, but they're tropes for a reason because they work. And dungeon mapping key. If you're mapping your dungeon by grid, it's by hand. It's important you and your group are able to tell what icons mean. There are many dungeon mapping keys out there. Strangely enough, not included in a lot of the D&D Dungeon Master guides. The 4th edition had one. I can't remember. I think the 5th edition one might have had one, but it wasn't in that dungeon creation section. It was in a separate section. But yeah, so you got to be in the adventure box. The first one that I had didn't have any of that information in it. It's not in that section at all, which is not helpful. If you're unsure how to map a specific type of feature, check out the free and updated Dungeon Legend from Dice and Logos, which you can find here. There's a little link here. I'm just going to click the link. Where are you not letting? Click the link. No. Anyways, you can search it up on your search engine of choice, Dice and Logos map key, and you can find it. It's from like 2020, I think, is when the last time you updated it. And it just shows you how to put things like, hey, the circle with the star in it for statues, the line with the S through it for secret doors, and just some common map items that allow you to, on a grid map, how to do things like stairs and show different elevation changes and stuff you'll need to know when you're making a map. So that way you can look at it and understand what notes you're trying to leave for yourself by using the key. And you can show it to other people and they will also understand it. And then at the end of the document, it's just like a little thanks for me. Yeah, thanks for checking it out. And I hope you found it useful. And a special guide to the players, and a special thanks to the players. There's many PCs I've pushed through my dungeons, those who perished along the way. Without your patience and sacrifice, this document wouldn't be possible. That is very true. Thank you to all my players, past, present, and future. You guys make it worth doing and make it fun. So I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do. If you like this guide, give me a shout out online. If you want more helpful aids and tips for running TTRPG games, check out this YouTube channel. You can check out the website, that's redragonfiend.com. You can check out the coffee, that's ko-fi.com/redragonfiend. Or I have some pay what you want titles on DriveThruRPG, so if you have some dollars, you can throw them my way. If you don't have any dollars, that's fine. You can download it for free. I don't care. I think it's more important to me that people have the ability to run fun, good games than it is for me to get rich off of it. I don't care that much about it. I have a real job. So this is all just for us having fun in the hobby. Make sure if you use this to make some dungeons, share your creations with me. Tag me online so I can check you out. Twitter, Blue Sky, Red Dragon Fiend on both. You can check that out, or throw it up on Reddit. Add that stuff in. All very fun. Yeah. Yeah, they don't include those anymore. Yeah. Always fun to make a partial map that the PCs require. Yeah, that's one of the things I have for my pocket contents. Is one thing you can require is like a partial map of the dungeon, which is fun, or a partial overland map too, or instructions on how to get to like a hidden cache or something like that. Very nice document, well documented, and thank you. Solid advice. Like and subscribe. Oh, thank you so much for teaching Grandma. That's going to be it for me. I am starting to lose my voice, and we're getting close to 4 hours on this stream. That's it. I'm tapped out. I got no more in me, folks. But this has been the second stream of 2 very long streams. I think the first one was even longer than this. But hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you like that, make sure to like and subscribe. Check out this other stuff on the YouTube channel. We got a bunch of other stuff we're talking about. If you have questions and all that stuff, throw them down in the comments. We'll take a look at them. And if you got, or you have ideas for things you want me to talk about, or give my ideas on how I run things, or you have questions about running, you can throw all that stuff down here. I've been doing this for some years, across some editions of D&D and other games. So I've got some, I think, some broad experience to be able to give you, and perhaps more than maybe somebody who's only played something like 5th edition, uh, and some ideas that kind of come from other different sources. But that's it. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, guys. These are always fun. And go out there and build some dungeons. That's it for me. I'll see you guys next time, alright? Bye.